Hi, Andrew. Can I just check you can hear me?
Hello, Andrew.
Oh, brilliant. You can hear me. I can't hear you. Bow tie. Would you be able to check the settings?
Can you hear me now, Mother?
I can hear you. Thank you very much. Welcome, Andrew.
Good. Thank you.
Ready to go?
About 10 seconds.
Okay. Good morning. Welcome to everybody. The London Assembly is the voice of London, composed of 25 elected members at the same time as the Mayor, in order to hold him to account and scrutinise his policies. This is a Mayor's Question Time meeting of the Assembly, which means that all members are invited to attend and ask questions of the Mayor. May I remind members that they may choose to wear a mask in the chamber unless speaking. Members are also reminded that any electronic devices should not only be placed on silent, but moved away from the microphones. In the case of emergency and any need to exit the building, guests are seated in the public gallery should follow the security staff, and Assembly members should follow the meeting clerk. As today sadly marks the 1 month since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I would like to ask members of the Assembly to stand for 1 minute to show our solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. Thank you. Can I now ask the clerk, Rebecca Arnold, to confirm any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. We have no apologies for absence, and we have Assembly Member Boff participating remotely.
Thank you. Although Assembly Member Boff is available to participate remotely, to chair the meeting it requires attendance in person, and therefore, as the Deputy Chair, I will be acting as Chair for this meeting. So I'd like to begin with an update on recent Assembly activities. Since we last met as a full Assembly at the start of March, the Police and Crime Committee discussed how London is tackling online fraud and questioned the Met and MOPAC on violence against women and girls and police resources. The Transport Committee questioned the TfL Commissioner. The Housing Committee discussed issues within the private rented sector, including standards of housing, enforcement and the powers of redress available to tenants. The GLA Oversight Committee considered the effectiveness of the management and delivery of the programme to relocate City Hall. Finally, the London Youth Assembly also met to discuss the Black Curriculum, the upcoming mental health event for Mental Health Awareness Week, and Young Londoners Question Time. We also released a plethora of reports and letters which needed to be published before the pre-election period begins. As there are so many of them, I will simply read out the list. Rebuilding London's tourism industry, the overcrowding issue, the future of London's circular economy, opportunity areas and housing zones, reducing drug-related deaths, NHS workforce shortages, apprenticeships, air pollution, violence against women and girls, plus mayoral planning applications. A wreath was also laid on Westminster Green on behalf of the London Assembly to remember PC Palmer and those who lost their lives or were injured in the Westminster attack of 2017. We now move to item 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask the Assembly to note the interest set out at item 2? Do Assembly members have any other disclosable pecuniary interests which relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? Or any other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality, which are not reflected on the authority's register of gifts and hospitality? Deafening silence. Lovely. Good. Item number 3. Sorry, that you right. That's right. Can I ask the Assembly to approve the minutes of the London Assembly plenary meeting held on the 10th of February and the 3rd of March 2022, as well as the London Assembly Mayor's Question Time meeting held on the 24th of February 2022, to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you very much. Item number 4, Mayor's Report. Can I ask the Assembly to formally receive the Mayor's Report covering the period from the 11th of February 2022 to 10th of March 2022? Thank you. The Mayor will now provide an oral update of up to 5 minutes in length on matters occurring since the publication of his report. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning. It's lovely to see you in the Chair's chair, Deputy Chair. I want to start by responding to the Government's spring statement, which was a missed opportunity to provide support for those who need it the most. The cost of living is continuing to soar and Londoners are being hit hard, with household budgets becoming severely squeezed. It's unacceptable that so many people can't afford to keep their homes warm and instead are facing stark choices between heating and eating. Yet no extra help has been announced for people who are struggling with rocketing energy bills. The national insurance increase will still go ahead next month. The Chancellor is refusing to raise welfare benefits in line with inflation, and there was precious little for businesses that are still struggling following the pandemic. What we needed to see was a further package of measures to support businesses, including a permanent lower VAT rate of 12.5% for the hospitality and leisure sectors. As Mayor, I'll continue to do what I can to ease the cost of living crisis in our city, whilst keeping up the pressure on the Government to finally take the action that's required. Following consultation with thousands of Londoners today, I'm publishing my new police and crime plan for London, which sets out 4 key priorities. First, reducing and preventing violence. Violent crime continues to fall in London, but there's still much more to do. Second, our plan set out my determination to drive through the necessary changes within the Met so that we can restore the public's trust in the police, which we know is so crucial to tackling crime. Third, the new plan builds on our efforts to support victims of crime and to ensure they get justice and the quality services they deserve. And fourth, we're setting out how we'll better tackle the exploitation of adults and young people in our city. Deputy Chair, as well as focusing on tackling crime, we've been busy since the last Mayor's Question Time working on the key issues that matter to Londoners. From launching a new campaign to help tackle violence against women and girls, it's not just meeting, but beating our target on council house building. Lastly, I hope I can speak on behalf of all of us here when I say how delighted we are that Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe, a Londoner, is now back home in London with her family after almost 6 years of wrongful imprisonment. Nazanin and her loved ones have shown great courage, strength and steadfastness during what has been an incredibly difficult time. And I want to pay tribute again to all those who campaigned tirelessly for her release. Thank you, Deputy Chair. I look forward to answering questions, but I've been asked for 3 oral updates. The first one is from Assemblymember Best on the Kerslake review. I would like to take this opportunity to publicly thank Lord Kerslake for working with rigour and at pace to conduct the independent review of GLA Group housing delivery. I would also like to thank everyone who contributed to the review, including those representing each GLA Group organisation, the wider housing sector and members of the London Assembly. I'm confident that this review will lay the path to enable a step change in how the GLA Group collaborates and delivers new, much-needed, genuinely affordable homes for Londoners. Lord Kerslake has made 15 recommendations which together will support a more unified, coherent and streamlined approach to housing delivery across the GLA Group. I've accepted the recommendations in full. In my formal response to the review published online alongside the report, I've set out exactly how I intend to take each of the recommendations forward with the wider GLA Group. I also published a statement of shared policy which has been endorsed by senior leaders across the group. Most significantly, I now intend to establish a City Hall developer over 2 stages. First, expanding the GLA's existing housing development activities, and second, piloting the direct delivery of housing in the next mayoral term. A City Hall developer has real potential to add significant capacity to London's housing sector. And the second request, Chair, is from Assemblymember Sem Moema. I'm disgusted and angered by the account of what a 15-year-old black schoolgirl from Hackney was subjected to. In my view, this is just another example of the Met Police Service falling below the standards we expect from them. The investigation by City and Hackney Safeguarding Board found that racism likely played a part in the decision to conduct the strip search, which has been extremely traumatic for the child and her family. I've written to the police watchdog, the IRPC, asking them to confirm if this case will be considered as gross misconduct rather than misconduct. The current Commissioner may not like it. The Chair of the Met Police Federation may not like it, but I'm clear that there are deep cultural issues in the police service in relation to racism, sexism, homophobia and discrimination. We will continue to scrutinise the data on strip searches, and I've asked the MPS to publish strip search data, which they were committed to doing as part of my action plan on transparency, accountability and trust. Discussions are also underway with every member of the MPS senior leadership team to understand how they will apply the learning from this terrible case across the whole of the organisation. At a time when recorded confidence in our police is at an all-time low, this highlights again the need for the next Commissioner to have a clear plan to tackle these serious cultural issues within the MPS and regain the trust of Londoners. Deputy Chair, the third request for an oral update was from Assemblymember Pigeon on the Daniel Morgan report. This was an appalling murder, and my thoughts are with Daniel Morgan's family and friends. After 35 years and numerous investigations and reviews, it's impossible to imagine what they've been through. While I welcome the MPS accepting the recommendations made by the independent panel, and I recognise that some progress has been made, the Police Inspectorate has since reported its findings on the case, and they're extremely worrying. It's crystal clear that we need urgent action, and this must be taken at the highest levels in the MPS. Corruption has no place in policing, and the failure to tackle it will have struck yet another blow to Londoners' trust and confidence in their police service. The Met Police Service leadership must now take decisive action. Vetting procedures, counter-corruption policies and the supervision of officers must all be improved. The organisation must also ensure it has sufficient professional standards capacity to proactively gather counter-corruption intelligence. Delivering on these findings is one of a number of very important issues the next Commission will need to urgently address. Rebuilding public trust and confidence in the police is essential. The public and the tens of thousands of hard-working police officers who've been so badly let down by the incompetence and misconduct of their colleagues need to see real change. I'll hold the Commissioner and the MPs to account in delivering it.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I will now call on Assembly members who have indicated. I'm going to start by calling Assembly Member Best.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, for that update. I'm glad that you've accepted the recommendations and report in full. Obviously, the part of that report was particularly damning of the shambolic approach to TfL housing delivery. You've accepted in the recommendations a number of different ways in which we can approach TfL housing delivery. But this has been going on for months, and communities, assembly members have been telling you there's been a problem with engagement. Can residents now expect a real step change in how TfL consult with them and the sort of developments they'll see in their communities?
Well, Deputy Chair, for political reasons, the members used the word shambolic, not used by Lord Kerslake. And I'd hasten to add, actually, the consultation hasn't been shambolic. I'll give you one example, where Enfield Council, after consulting residents, and TfL, after consulting residents, gave permission for a development to go ahead, and lo and behold, the Secretary of State stepped in after lobbying from a Member of Parliament in a marginal seat to stop homes being built for Londoners, because the Secretary of State believes a car park is more important. What Londoners need is homes, not car parks. So I've got no problems at all with the way TfL consults, and Lord Kerslake had no problems at all with the way TfL consults. I'm happy to send the member a copy of the report, because clearly she's misreading what Lord Kerslake said.
Thanks. I'll read it out for you then, Mr Mayor, thanks. It says, poor engagement with local authorities and community, and it lays that blame solely at TfL's door.
Not in relation to the schemes the member is talking about. The issue in relation to TfL's development has been an issue accelerated by the government freezing TfL's ability to spend money over the last 2 years and a number of issues caused by the pandemic. Clearly, once we get a long-term deal from the government, we'll be able to do more work in relation to homes that TfL can start. I'm quite clear. Lord Kerslake made a number of recommendations, all of which are recommendations that I accept. TfL has a role to play as part of the GLA family in relation to housing starts, in relation to surplus land they no longer need. They're hamstrung by the fact that the government is refusing to give them a long-term deal. We are the only public transport authority in the world without government support in terms of revenue.
Mr Mayor, you're
long-term
conflating things that aren't to do with this, so we'll end there, I think. You've clearly made it clear you didn't read the report, but you did accept it anyway, so I'm a bit confused, but thanks.
Not the first time.
Thank you. Assembly Member Duval.
Sorry, Chair, did you not want to take... I'm coming in on the back of a question, but other people have raised specific questions. I know I've indicated, but I was going to come in on the back of someone who personally raised...
I just assumed that you were going to take the point that Assembly Member Mohamed was going to...
No, okay. No, Chair, I'm coming in on the back of a specific issue raised by Assembly Member Pidgeon, who's requested an oral update, and I'm following on that from that. I don't mind coming in now, but I just think it's out of courtesy. It should be the Assembly member that raised the oral update should be taken first, and I should follow on.
Well, I think that's very gracious of you, Assembly Member Duval, so I'll hand it to Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Thank you very much. As you've mentioned, Mr Mayor, this week we've also seen Her Majesty Inspectorate's damning report into the Met's approach to tackling corruption following the Morgan panel report, which highlighted poor evidence storage, drugs going missing, officers not being vetted at the appropriate level. And whilst I agree with what you've said, that action needs to be taken at the highest levels of the Met to regain trust and confidence, what actions will you be taking in relation to the serious concerns raised in this report?
Well, I'd agree with the characterisation of the report as damning in relation to the police still having not learned lessons 35 years later, despite the reassurances given by the Commissioner to the Deputy Mayor and myself. You'll be aware of the key examples highlighted in the report. I'm not going to go over them just to save time. So MOPAC and the Deputy Mayor in particular will be looking into some of the actions that are required in relation to the report from the HMI. It's quite clear the report published last week from the Met Police Service in response to Daniel Morgan aren't adequate in relation to the points raised by HMI. If you remember, what the Met Police agreed to do was to respond to the recommendations that applied to the Met Police Service. A number applied to the Home Office and so forth. And that was a report last week. It's quite clear the HMI is not satisfied in relation to what the Met Police are saying. So the Deputy Mayor and myself will be looking into what more needs to happen urgently in relation to what the HMI has said. Matt Parr's report is damning in relation to lessons not being learned, action not being taken 35 years on, despite the response from the Met Police last week. Not good enough, and that's why we'll be following that up.
Thank you. And the Inspectorate's report particularly highlighted 2,000 unaccounted for warrant cards, which is simply appalling, especially considering a warrant card, although it wasn't missing, was part of Wayne Couzens' method of entrapping Sarah Everard. So what urgent actions are you taking to ensure the unaccounted for warrant cards are identified and returned? And will you commit to working with the Met's leadership to immediately implement improvements to this clear security risk?
So there are three of the recommendations, the three of the facts highlighted that caused me concern. That was one of them. The other one was in the past years, the Met's recruited people with criminal connections and more than 100 who have committed offences. And the third one that caused me concern, particular concern, they all caused me concern, was the force doesn't know whether all those insensitive posts, such as child protection, major crime investigation and informant handling, had been cleared to the level of security vetting needed. So the Deputy Mayor's asked the Senior Met Police leadership to respond to those. She'll be making sure that she has the reassurance she needs, but also we need to look into what more we can do with the Home Office, because some of the issues are national issues. The bad news is this isn't just a Met Police issue. One of the reasons why the recommendations made by the panel are owned by the Home Office is there are national issues, including with the College of Police and so forth. So we'll be liaising with others, including the Home Office, in relation to issues to be learnt nationally that may affect the Met Police Service, but a number of the conclusions of fact were of considerable concern.
Well, the Met has clearly spent a significant amount of time and resources disputing the charge of institutional corruption. This week's report also made clear that despite the acceptance that the force needs to listen more and be less defensive, the Met had ignored concerns about counter-corruption for many, many years. How will you and the Deputy Mayor make the Met more transparent and open to those comments, those criticisms? So not only can it improve these internal failings, but also regain the confidence of Londoners?
It's important, Deputy Chair, to be clear, the HMI did not find institutional corruption, and it's very important to not pick and choose which parts of the HMI report you want to cherry pick. So the HMI found there isn't institutional corruption, but clearly there are practices and issues that need addressing. But also it's clear that without the proper oversight, it leads to an environment where police officers it's possible to behave in a way which shouldn't be possible, and that's a key thing. You should make it very difficult for anybody who wants to behave in an inappropriate way to behave in an inappropriate way, aside from checking who comes in, checking they don't become, inverted commas, corrupt when they're in, and making sure those that are, you kick out. So there's three separate issues in relation to before, during, and kicking out that are really important. And the HMI report highlighted a number of findings of fact that weren't facts the MPS thought existed. And that's why it's important to have checks and balances on police. Who pleases the police is really important.
Absolutely, and making sure they listen more is really important. Many officers put themselves at risk every day to keep us safe, but I think they've been let down, and I think from what you've said, you probably agree, by poor leadership. I think the Met needs a major shake-up. If the Met had a chief executive alongside a new commissioner, they could focus on the organisational failings, the cultural change, what excellent looks like, whilst a new commissioner could focus on the operational policing. What do you think of this proposal? And is this something that you will discuss with the Home Secretary going forward?
No, I'm not persuaded by a chief executive for either the Met Police Service, the Fire Brigade, or indeed TfL, or indeed the GLA. But I'm happy to listen to arguments in favour of. I'm not persuaded.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I will call you now, Assemblymember Deval.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I thank you for the way that you answered earlier the question relating to the experiences of the young woman from Hackney and the way that you've condemned it, which I think is shared by everybody around this table in terms of what took place there. I want to now turn to the Morgan report. So a number of us, both publicly and privately over the years, have always said we should use the Morgan reports and inquiries to actually do our work in a modern day setting, use it to actually understand what's been going on. My premise and starting point, I think mostly, is not all police officers are corrupt, and no way should they. And sometimes it comes across that when we talk about the organisation, that we are damning every serving police officer, police support staff about the way that they go about their work. And I think we need to be careful about that. And I have to remind myself, because I think the tendency is to do that. But there is a problem here. There is a problem that you've identified, others have identified, and in terms of this report about attitudinal and approaches that need to be challenged. But there are a couple of key issues. And, you know, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves, I don't think the way, and you have to read the panel's report about institutional corruption, that I think the Inspectorate's got it right. There are a couple of things that we could do very quickly here and make it clear to the police how they engage with public inquiries, whether statutory or not, is quite important. We've still got some outstanding issues, and we're waiting to hear from the Police and Crime Committee about how the police engaged during that inquiry, because one of the chief issues with the institutional corruption was the way the panel was engaged by the Metropolitan Police, that they saw was slipping and sliding, delay tactics,
Assembly member,
and not matters of
Can I just
issues.
remind you that you need a question?
So I will wind up, Chair.
No, I'm just looking for the question.
Yeah, I will come to a question, Chair. We'll come to it. But I think it's in terms of the context about what's took place. So on that issue, I still think it's worth pursuing, and in terms of where we are. The real issue is, and I don't claim to speak for the family, and this is the question, but there is a perception of the family. Now, in the HMI report, they suggested there was a degree of indifference to the risk of corruption, and the Metropolitan Police sometimes behaved in ways that make it appear arrogant, secretive and lethargic. Mr Mayor, the family have been in meetings, and I know this is not the case. I know your position on this, but they believe that you're all part of the same system. You, the Metropolitan Police Service, are actually been pushing back against the Morgan family view. Now, as I said, I don't claim to meet with them. I can only repeat what they've said. What can we do now to try and change that perception, and will you meet again with the family? I understand relationships are not good, to actually see how we can explore that again and some of their ideas about tackling some of the wider corruptions in the Metropolitan Police Service based on the experiences they faced.
Sure. So Deputy Chair, I've offered, as is the Deputy Mayor, to meet with the family, and for understandable reasons they declined, and I'm not criticising them at all for declining. In relation to anybody who thinks that I'm the same or part and parcel or in cahoots, the chair of the Met Police Federation wouldn't agree, nor would the Commissioner or her deputy.
Thank you. Could I call on Assembly Member Moema, please?
Thank you. I'll be brief, and that confusion was my fault, so apologies. I want to thank you for your update, and just to say that I attended last night's first public meeting with the Commander, Marcus Barnett, and his senior leadership team. So it feels we definitely need to move away from condemnation, I think, to what feels like a more clear action plan that can be implemented locally in this BCU as a matter of urgency, but I think also across the board, and I'm sure others will be able to speak to that. So one of the things that has been a real issue, and looking to the recruitment of a new commissioner as well, is that for Black Londoners, in this particular instance, the acknowledgement of racism being a factor is really, really important in order to build that trust and confidence. I raised that yesterday with the Assistant Commissioner, and in particular for Child Q and for other young Black Londoners, that's really important. Because there is that perception that Black Londoners are under-policed as victims and are over-policed as potential perpetrators. So I just wonder what more can be done in the next days and months to make sure that that does happen. So we speak alongside racism and homophobia and misogyny. We also, the police, get to a point where they can say the R word and talk about racism and how that may inform some of the decisions being made operationally.
Well, thanks. I mean, anybody who looks at the facts of the case can't be other than angered and disgusted by what happened to that child. She's a child, right? I think it's possible to say there are decent, dedicated, brave police officers, but at the same time say there are deep cultural issues. of racism and so forth that you've referred to. I'm quite clear in my views in relation to what we need as a city with the next commissioner. Unfortunately, unlike other police and crime commissioners across the country, I don't appoint the next commissioner. It's the Home Secretary, who needs to have due regard to my views, but it's Home Secretary. And so what I'd advise you and those in the community who feel strongly about this is I'd encourage you to write to the Home Secretary so she understands the strength of feeling about making sure we get the right person for the job. You've got to acknowledge there's an issue before you can have a plan to address the issue and then win back the trust and confidence. But also intrinsic to our way of policing by consent is trust and confidence, right? Because if victims don't come forward, witnesses don't come forward, potential police officers don't come forward, that's a problem for fighting crime because the bad people get away with it. And so I will make sure that the next commissioner understands my concerns. But bearing in mind, I don't appoint, I only make sure my views are heard by the Home Secretary. I'd encourage you and others to make sure the Home Secretary understands the strength of feeling.
Thank you. I now look to Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you, and I'd just like to confirm that you did choose the Commissioner this, Cressida Dick. You did actually choose her, but I'll go on to my question, or my points. The Police and Crime plan has been published this morning. I find it somewhat disappointing that we had a Police and Crime meeting yesterday and the timing of this was not told to any of us. But can you confirm that this new plan has taken on board comments from the PCC meeting on the 1st of December? And I'll just give you a couple. The HMI's Matthew Parr said that it feels like a plan written 10 or 15 years ago. Patrick Green from the Ben Kinsella Trust said, I would say that this does not feel a document written for the 2020s. And he also said that the scale and complexity of crime is not recognised. Can you confirm that this has been taken into account when writing the plan?
Well, Deputy Chair, first to clarify a misunderstanding, the current Commissioner was appointed by the Home Secretary at the time, having due regard to my views. So I'm sorry if that's not with your understanding, but the Home Secretary at the time appointed her, the advisement to
you
Her Majesty.
You welcomed your first female Commissioner, but carry on.
After having due regard to my views, absolutely. And we should pay tribute to the current Commissioner for making history as the first female Commissioner of the Met Police Service, and it is something to be proud about. In relation to the Police and Crime Plan, we've taken on board the more than 4,000 responses received. I can't comment on any particular one, but of course, one of the things that was sought to happen during the consultation phase was to consult as widely as possible. Never before has the consultation been as wide as this one was, but we also use different ways of engaging with Londoners, and all those views were received and many taken on board in relation to the Police and Crime Plan, which is different in many ways from the draft as it was published. And I'm sure when the Police and Crime Committee have a chance to look at the new plan versus the draft, they will see some of the additions made.
Well, we'll have a look. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And thank you for your update, Mr. Mayor. So we now move to the highlight of the day, questions to the Mayor. So we now move to the questions on the priority order paper. Each group is allocated an amount of time to ask their questions, which is appropriate to their size. The first question is question number 2022/1223, and it's about Redbridge Roundabout, and it's in my name. Just to tell you, Mr. Mayor, I will not be asking you a supplementary.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. TfL has made a series of improvements in the area in recent years, but the simple fact is that this is a busy roundabout, and no matter how many interventions TfL makes, congestion will only be properly eased further by a reduction in traffic using the roundabout. Following a collision study with detailed traffic modelling work at Redbridge Roundabout, a road danger reduction scheme was implemented by TfL in September 2019. The scheme better directed circulatory traffic around the roundabout through improvements to the directional and lane markings and the removal of a pinch point on the southeastern edge of the roundabout, which was implemented to improve large vehicle movements. The road was also fully resurfaced. Over several years, TfL has also made a variety of changes and improvements to the traffic light timings at the roundabout in order to optimise traffic operation, including helping the egress of traffic from the Borough Road Redbridge Lane East. Further changes made in 2020 have also had a positive effect on the queues on the roundabout. This is a very busy location with high levels of traffic flow. TfL's analysis shows that the current operation of the traffic lights is optimal for one of the busiest traffic interchanges in London. TfL has examined the proposal of adding traffic signals to Redbridge Road East arm of the roundabout, but detailed traffic modelling found that every possible scenario would lead to significant queuing and delays. There have also been calls for a major infrastructure intervention such as a flyover or underpass to relieve pressure on the roundabout. Aside from the fact that it's simply not possible while TfL remains under such acute financial strain due to the impacts of the pandemic, the solution here is not new heavy infrastructure, it's to reduce traffic. TfL will continue to monitor traffic in this area and, as part of the commitment set out in my transport strategy, is always open to discussing interventions that will improve streets for people, especially those that will promote active travel, reduce traffic volumes overall and reduce road danger for vulnerable road users. However, in the absence of a longer-term funding settlement with the government, TfL is unable to consider or commit to further highway changes at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I now look to Assembly Member Bakari for her question on awareness of air pollution in London.
Thank you. Since first being elected, I've made tackling and raising awareness of air pollution a priority. And unlike when I was first elected in 2016, polling now consistently shows that over 3/4 of Londoners understand that air pollution is a problem in London. In 2016, I introduced London's first alert system to warn Londoners about air pollution episodes. Alerts are displayed across the public transport and road networks, shared on social media, and sent directly to over 3,000 schools and all London boroughs. On Tuesday, I used this system to issue a high air pollution alert for yesterday and today, as London is currently being affected by pollution from the continent alongside a build-up of local emissions. The London Resilience Forum now also cascades the alerts to its network, which include emergency responders, transport providers, the NHS, London boroughs and our faith, business, voluntary and community sectors. London now has the world's largest air quality monitoring network. As part of this, I funded the Breathe London network of low-cost sensors to provide user-friendly information, and there are now nearly 300 sensors across London, including at hospitals, schools and sites chosen by community groups and London boroughs. Live data from all monitors in London is available through the Breathe London website, providing Londoners for the first time with easy access to reliable real-time air quality data right down to the level of their street, school or home. I've also commissioned and publicised groundbreaking research which is used to raise awareness of the health impacts of pollution and the need for action. One issue our research shows Londoners are less clear on is the impacts of wood burning on air quality. So I've used my social media channels during the colder months to raise awareness and working on finessing this messaging for next winter. My offices have also helped secure £300,000 of DEFRA funding to quantify and raise awareness of the impacts of wood burning, with the research element of this work getting underway next month. The recent Clean Air and Health Summit I convened was a huge success, with the health and care system committing to amplifying messaging on the need to improve air quality and tackle health inequalities, a commitment reiterated at the London Health Board.
Thank you. Now, last month that you told me current public messaging does not strike the right balance between providing health guidance to those most vulnerable to pollution and encouraging all Londoners to adapt their behaviours to reduce pollution. So I really welcome the press statement on Tuesday night informing people of high levels of pollution and urging Londoners to look after each other by choosing to walk, cycle, use public transport and avoiding car journeys that are unnecessary, idling and burning wood. Are you acknowledging now that public messaging should be about taking action to prevent air pollution, not just expecting vulnerable people to hide from it?
Well, the problem with the premise in that question is exception now. I'm the guy that implemented the biggest air quality network system in the world and the air quality alert. So it's not new because of a Lib Dem intervention. It's because we did this in 2016 because it's the right thing to do. It's, and anybody who reads the outcome of the summit we recently held will have seen the progress made persuading health practitioners to also play their role. I appreciate allies joining the campaign, and I look forward to the Lib Dems playing a more active role going forward as well.
we need people to trust the evidence on air pollution, and on the 12th and the 13th of January you issued a moderate pollution alert on the 13th and 14th of January, but on the 13th of January DEFRA issued a very high pollution alert for the 14th of January. It's all very confusing for the public, and it might be a reason why there are still people who are just ignoring the advice not to idle, drive and burn wood. So what progress has been made to review the trigger levels for high pollution alerts, and will you commit to publishing the outcome for this review?
Well, again, this is already in train, so another danger of the Lib Dems claiming victory for something we've already agreed to do. So just to explain, the alert we use from London looks at 3 different data sets, including the DEFRA data set, the Met Office model, alongside Airtext and Imperial College. The DEFRA data set is different and relies upon one data source. As a consequence of the Air Quality and Health Summit I chaired, not on recommendation of Lib Dems, I chaired this. We made a number of recommendations, and one of them was to have a better system of making the information available to the public. We agreed that the GLA will conclude its review of alerts messaging in London within the next 6 months, engaging with DEFRA to ensure a consistent national approach.
Right, so Rosamond, as you know, the mother of a 9-year-old Ella, who died of a severe asthma attack in 2013, said that before her daughter's death, she actually wasn't aware of just how dangerous air pollution was. Now, everyone needs to be fully aware of the levels of air pollution in every part of London. Therefore, Londoners deserve a targeted air pollution alerts for real behaviour change. London Air and Breathe London websites feature London's air monitoring network, but has many gaps. Many roads are not covered, especially in outer London. Will you commit to improving current provision for air pollution monitors, especially on TfL routes? And will you also look into making there's proper monitoring in all access roads, including the Silvertown Tunnel?
Well, firstly, it was me as the mayor who helped Rosamond get the fresh inquest, because she wasn't satisfied with the first inquest. And so I wrote to the Attorney General. I worked closely with Professor Stephen Holgate to make sure we shared all the information we had. One of the things I discovered during the first few weeks of me being mayor was a report had been done by the previous mayor that had been buried away, which showed just what you're saying, that at the time we knew that there was air pollution from local roads, and you'll remember that Rosamond lives near the South Circular. And that's one of the reasons why we think the air alert system is so important, and real-time information is so important with the air quality sensors we've got across London. So I'm happy to send you, because we're in danger of going in circles, Deputy Chair, I'm happy to send you the 6 different actions from the London Clean Air and Health Summit, which will address the question which may have been superseded by what was agreed at the London Clean Air and Health Summit.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm afraid the Liberal Democrats are out of time. I've seen Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to start, Mr. Mayor, by thanking you for the collaborative approach that you're taking to tackling air pollution, and I appreciated the invite to Forest Hill School, where you launched your recent air pollution consultation, or looking forward to the consultation. Now, in that speech, you said that we are facing triple dangers of a climate emergency, air pollution crisis and the congestion crisis. Now, I agree with 2/3 of that. We are clearly facing a climate emergency, and we can't start in 2029 to tackle it for 2030. We're facing an air pollution crisis. Dr. Ian Mudway recently told the Environment Committee that there are children growing up in this city with stunted lungs, depending on where they grow. On the congestion crisis, though, I think this is partly about how we look at it. I would say it's a toxic traffic crisis. And what I just want to clarify for you is, obviously, the intention here is to reduce air pollution, and we absolutely agree on that. But what is the priority? Is it to reduce congestion or to reduce toxic traffic?
Well, thank you for your question. Can I just say, sparing the blushes, I mean, Sian and Caroline have been fantastic on this issue, chivvying, pushing, so forth, and working collegially, which is really important. And I welcome your involvement as well. So a number of issues in relation to congestion. Yes, you're right. One of the consequences is the poor quality air caused by traffic. A good example is around the Blackwall Tunnel, an area that I know well, in relation to congestion leading to poor quality air, but also having an impact on productivity of the businesses because they can't move around because they're stuck in traffic, but also public transport being hindered because of congestion. And so people not jumping in on the bus because they know it's unreliable. So there are a number of things we're trying to address by saying cut congestion, reduce air pollution, but also tackle the climate emergency as well. And reducing congestion does improve air quality, does improve productivity, but also it saves the NHS huge sums of money because you're not breathing in the stuff while you're stuck in traffic.
You'll be very aware, as I am, though, of induced road demand, this idea that if you build more roads, then you will get more traffic. And when you say people are stuck in traffic, they are the traffic. So isn't there a really important messaging here about reducing traffic and not congestion?
You'd have a good point if there were river crossings in the east like there are in the west of London. If you stand on Tower Bridge and look west, I think there are 18 bridges and crossings. If you look east, I think there's 1 or 2. So one of the reasons is because the centre of our city has always been in the west, and it's moving and gravitating to the east, as indeed are the people. And it's also an issue of social justice. Why is it all the bridges and crossings are in the west? In the east, we could now have potentially, well, we will in the next few years, for the first time, lanes reserved for buses, double-decker buses. Nowhere else in London does that happen. That's one of the advantages of a tunnel with 2 lanes reserved for double-decker buses.
Isn't the bigger issue of social justice that the people of Greenwich and Newham has a high community of people of colour and working-class communities, don't want a new Silvertown tunnel? So why don't we just toll the Blackwall tunnel because we want to reduce traffic and congestion and not build a new tunnel at all?
It doesn't work because the infrastructure is Victorian. It has, on average, 700 closures a year. Every 6-minute closure leads to a 3-mile tailback. Tolling just the Blackwall tunnel won't alleviate the problems caused by a Victorian piece of infrastructure, which is built on a bend to stop the horses bolting. That's how old it is. And so it is an issue of social justice that poorer people, you mentioned people of colour, have Victorian infrastructure, whereas those in other parts of the city have new infrastructure. I think they deserve infrastructure that's modern, that's sustainable, as will happen with not just a tunnel that's tolled, but one that's within the expanded ULEZ area, and potentially with our plans would be included within not just an expanded ULEZ, but also we're hoping we're going to move towards smart road user charging as well.
With smart road user charging, that's obviously the fairest way that we can do things, as well as a scrappage scheme. And I should say that I'm pleased to hear that there will be new money for scrappage, and there's going to be a consultation on that. I hope that consultation will be clearly co-designed, so that will involve communities most affected. Now, when I asked Christina Calderatto about this, TfL's Director of Policy, she said to me that your 2030 date is not necessarily a target. In fact, it's more a deadline. It will be done by 2030. Do you have a date for when smart road user charging will come in?
Well, good question. No. So the technology just simply isn't advanced enough. So we are doing the work required. Expanding the ULEZ isn't a done deal, by the way. We're going to consult formally from May, so we shouldn't assume we've extended ULEZ to all of Greater London. We've got to do one thing at a time. But we are in parallel. We have been for some time. We always keep road user charging under review. The issue is we've not found anywhere around the world that's got anywhere near the system we need. You can look at other parts of the world. It's ostensibly a congestion charge rather than road user charging. So I think the use of the word deadline is good. I agree with that. But I couldn't give you a date by which it would start by, because it's a question of what technology there is. You and I both are concerned about privacy issues and so forth, so it's really important we get it right. And so I think it would be wrong for me to give a date. Realistically, I think the next term is the ambition we want to meet.
So I'm sure you'll know that Trust for London did a report in 2018 that said that road user charging is ready to go. So I'd really push you on the urgency with that. But just my final question.
If it was, Trust for London would patent it and make a lot of money.
Sorry to interrupt, and it's a very good exchange and they're very good questions, but just to get the ground rules right for our conversation here, do we have to stick to the question, or are we now having any question, we can chuck any old bits in that we want to do afterwards, Chair? With all due respect, the member is fairly new and may not be acquainted with that. They are good questions, but not appropriate under this original question. So what's the rules? What's the rules?
Well, you're not incorrect, Assembly Member Duval, but when he originally asked or started asking, he did mention pollution, which is where it is.
Point of order, could our clock be stopped?
And yeah,
it's been going quite some time.
And I was just being a little bit generous because, as you quite rightly pointed out, he is a new member, but it's a fair challenge, and if it was, have I got a clue, I'd give you a point for that. But I think if we allow the member to conclude, and I suspect that means that we won't have his question further down the order paper. But
I don't wish to prolong this, but that's even worse, isn't it? Because what you could do, if you were scrupulous, and I'm not suggesting the member is.
Thank you.
Bring the question further up in the paper to do that and bypass all the other issues. If we have processes and procedures, I don't want a stickler to it. I want to be tolerant, and I was tolerant in listening to the member. But we need to stick to our rules to some degree, and he did try to stick to the plan.
I think, you know, I do understand what you're saying, Assembly Member, and you're probably the most experienced member in the room. However, as with all these things, the amount of time that we spend debating the right and wrongs of it, if we'd have let him finish, he'd have been finished by now. So I'm intending to let him to finish. But I will warn other members that in future, no, Assembly Member, you made your point. I accept your point. However, it's going to be a lot quicker and easier if we just let the member finish now. Thank you. Pardon? No, he's not. It's tenuous, but he is talking about air pollution. No. I'm now going to go and ask the member to finish.
To fight air pollution.
Thank you.
I don't even agree with him, but he's right.
Right. Assemblyman Palansky, can you wind up now, please?
Thank you. I look forward to smart road user charging to fight air pollution. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Brilliant. Brilliant. I love it. Right, so now on to...
Deputy Chair, you've not seen the look in the Chair's face on Zoom.
Yeah, I know, yeah. I think Assemblymember Cooper just caught my eye earlier, so Assemblymember Cooper, the floor is yours. Can you make sure you stick to pollution?
Thank you, Chair. I thought I might return to the topic of Londoners' awareness of the effects of air pollution, which I kind of thought was where Assemblymember Bakari had started. I, too, like Assemblymember Polansky, had the privilege of being at the launch and listening to your remarks in Forest Hill about the impending consultation on the London-wide Greater London ULEZ proposal. I also, which he didn't, had the privilege of being at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital when you called for a new Clean Air Act, which is something that the Assembly wrote to the government about in November, asking for tighter emission limits to be set on wood-burning stoves, as well as providing stronger enforcement powers to local authorities. We haven't heard back. I know you've been asking the government about this. Is there any news at all about strengthening powers for people who can actually take the action to raise awareness of pollution? Thank you.
No, thank you. I remember that speech really well, Great Ormond Street. I think Caroline was there as well, actually. Shows the cross-party working together, Leonie. But you're right. The generation of politicians in the 1950s were incredibly brave. They passed the Clean Air Act. There was pressure on them not to do so. But the great smog, you could see it, you couldn't miss it. And so they passed the Clean Air Act. And that led to the power stations from the centre of our cities moving out. And that's why we have, redundant power stations, now great galleries and homes and so forth. We get the same sort of bravery from the current generation of politicians in Parliament with a new Clean Air Act, fit for purpose for the 21st century. So we're hoping that the Environment Act may have some of this in there. It hasn't. And even some of the targets are 2040 rather than 2030, and you'll know how unhappy Rosamond is about 2040 rather than 2030. But there's an opportunity for the government in relation to, now we know the link between dirty air and climate change, for them to take action. And I've met with George Eustace. We're lobbying the government. His predecessor, Michael Gove, I also lobbied and stuff. And any help the Assembly can give on a cross-party basis is good. We're also working with UK 100 across the country, towns, cities and regions to lobby the government. I think it's really important to use this window to have a new Clean Air Act. It's crucial, particulate matter, PM 2.5, PM10, nitrogen dioxide, ozone and so forth. We've got to be addressing these issues.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor, and thank you. Actually, I was sitting next to Assemblymember Russell. We sat there together, and inspirational then, inspirational more recently. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right, now, unfortunately, we move to the more serious matter of the question from Assemblymember McCartney, which is support to Ukraine refugees. Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. We're watching a grave and deepening humanitarian crisis unfold in Ukraine. I know that Londoners are horrified by the actions of Putin's regime. It's truly humbling to see that so many have already offered their help and support, demonstrating that our city stands with Ukraine and with tens of thousands of Ukrainians that live in the UK. I heard this morning, Deputy Chair, President Zelensky and I've no doubt that this Saturday thousands of Londoners will take to the streets to show their support during the march from Park Lane to Trafalgar Square to show their solidarity, as President Zelensky asked us to do this morning. As countries in Europe provide sanctuary to more than 3 million people fleeing the violence, in contrast, the shambolic approach from the Home Office has left people unable to access visas to reach the UK, and it's a source of national shame. I've been calling on our government to provide an immediate route to safety in the UK by waiving complex visa requirements that are causing unnecessary delays and hardship and putting providers under incredible strain. I'm also calling on the government to ensure that comprehensive funding is provided to local authorities and civil society, both of which will play a crucial role in delivering the high standards of safeguarding and support that will be vital to the success of the Homes for Ukraine scheme. My team will continue to work closely with civil servants, boroughs and civil society on this as the scheme launches. Urgent change is needed to ensure that the thousands of people currently trapped in the asylum system continue to be a priority, including those evacuated from Afghanistan who are still awaiting resettlement. It is unacceptable that thousands of vulnerable people in need of sanctuary have been accommodated in unsuitable hotel accommodation for so long. Through the London Strategic Migration Partnership, I bring together councils, health partners, funders and civil society to identify and address urgent issues, facilitate coordination and prepare for a large increase in arrivals. So far, our engagement has identified significant capacity issues amongst the organisations, providing legal advice to displaced people and their families. The GLA is working to expand the scope of current programmes to meet the new needs of Ukrainians, alongside our long-standing work to support migrants, refugees and people seeking asylum in our city.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and I will be joining you on the march on Saturday. I suspect many members of this Assembly will be. And I'm very glad to hear that you're urging the government to up their game, because quite frankly, I think the response of our government compared to those of our European neighbours has been shameful. Now, you recently wrote to us with regards to the work that your office was doing with regards to Afghani refugees. And in that, you were able to waive certain restrictions and relax restrictions with regards to access to the adult education budget. Is that something that you're hoping to offer again to Ukrainian refugees?
Yes, just to remind colleagues, we've given those who arrive from Afghanistan free access to the training you refer to, a waiver for family members as well. We're asking the government to ensure Ukrainian refugees are given the same entitlements to adult education and those who want to learn English as a second language, as well as the scheme you mentioned. We've not heard back from the government yet. The good news is there's no urgent need yet, but hopefully once people start arriving, there will be a need. And we're also keen, by the way, not just adult education. Deputy Mayor Rajesh Agrawal is working with Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard to make sure we can link up employers also with those arriving. Many arriving will have great tech skills, software skills and so forth. So, for those that are ready to work, we're trying to link them up with employees who want to take them on as well.
Good. And you're obviously working with the London boroughs. What are the main concerns that they're raising with you? I mean, I've heard about lack of funding or uncertainty about funding, school places and lack of housing, for example. Well,
it's just worth reminding ourselves, and that's why I deliberately did so in my answer to your first question, was we still have an issue in relation to finding permanent homes for those who arrive from Afghanistan. And so the councils are keen not to forget those who are already here, to give them the support they need. What's clear, though, when people arrive as refugees is often they need wraparound support. They may be traumatised, suffering PTSD or have other health issues, so we need to make sure the local health system can cope with that. If they've got children, we need to make sure the schools have the capacity to take on additional children. They may have additional challenges that require funding. And we've also got to make sure that the community where large numbers may arrive have the support to avoid any issues around community cohesion. And so we're asking the government to make sure there's that wraparound support. It's great that people are being generous, giving up rooms and so forth, but without the support, it could lead to real problems down the road. And so we're trying to coordinate with London councils who do a brilliant job, but also sit on the London Strategic Migration Partnership, making sure the government understand some of the issues that may arise. And by the way, the vast majority will come to London for obvious reasons.
Yep, thank you very much. It's good to hear the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I've seen Assembly Member Boff from afar.
Thank you, Chair. I apologise for not being there in person, as I am attending the Council of Europe's Congress of Local and Regional Authorities in Strasbourg, and I regret I will soon have to leave this meeting. The Ukrainian delegation here, 5 brave women who had to drive for 3 days from Kyiv to get here, to make the rest of Europe aware of the situation in their country, have asked me to extend their particular gratitude to the United Kingdom government, British local authorities, and British people in general for their generosity, support, and military assistance. Whilst local and regional authorities don't have weapons to send to Ukraine, they can and are providing help in the form of food, medicine, clothes, and combat uniforms. This cruel war needs to end, but Putin has the support of the majority of Russians because the truth of this conflict has been hidden from them. A new program by the Congress involves trying to get that truth through to the Russian people. That is why they are asking mayors in free Europe to directly email or mail a number of their peers who head cities and local authorities in Russia, in Russian, to argue that this is a war crime. My simple question to you, Mr. Mayor, is will you be part of that programme?
Well, Chair, can I just say thank you for your comments and your question. Your contribution is inspiring and moving. Let me take away what we can do, because I think you're right in relation to the ability we have to put pressure on decent people in Russia. And it's worth disentangling Putin's actions and the actions of decent Russians, many of whom are Londoners and are decent people. So let me take that away, Andrew. And what I'll do is, Deputy Chair, I'll let the Assembly know what we'll be doing. One of the ways we can show them our solidarity with Ukraine, but also send a message to Putin's Russia, is by a big turnout on Saturday. Because I can assure you, despite the best efforts of Putin, the people in Russia will see how people around the world view the actions of Putin. But I'm not sure if Andrew's still here, but thank you for what you said, and let me take that away. And it's inspiring what you've said, and let me take that away.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've now seen Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chair. This is a technical question about people arriving in London. Two parts of it, and this is something that you'll have some direct influence over because it's TfL. One is the children who are arriving, who will be going to school. Will there be TfL support for them in terms of journey with Oyster cards, etc.? Because it will be quite complicated to register them at addresses. The second is foreign-plated cars that might be driving over from Ukraine as well. It takes 10 days to register with TfL, so will they be impacted by any charging or anything? Thank you, Deputy Chair. So I can't answer the first question. I can't on the second one. I'll take that away, though, if that's OK with you. So the first one, yes, the TfL also have given help to adults who may need to get across London, either because they're going in other parts of the country or because they simply haven't got the ability to go across London. So TfL moved pretty quickly. It's a soft-touch approach. All TfL staff have been advised what to do if somebody comes through who's from Ukraine. On the children's issue, that's not yet arisen, but can I take that away as well? Because obviously children will arrive, and it takes time. And often where they may be staying will be different to where they'll be going to school and elsewhere. On the non-plate stuff, I've not been briefed on that, but again, it's going to be an issue, and particularly because people will be arriving across mainland Europe. Can I take that away, Deputy Chair? Thanks for raising that. I'm sure it's been thought about by the people at TfL, but it may not have been. And so let me take that away. So just to add, because one of the things maybe they might not have bank accounts, and a lot of the TfL system is automated. Understood. We mustn't assume people have thought of it. That's why I'm glad you've raised it. I'll promise I'll take it away, and I'll get back to you so you can be reassured.
Thank you. We now move to question number 0977 in the name of Assembly Member Russell about reforming the police.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Police in London is a huge responsibility and a great challenge, and it's important that we recognise all those officers who work so tirelessly to keep us safe. But the MPS has experienced a series of deeply troubling issues that must not be ignored, and it's clearer than ever that the organisation is in need of reform. Baroness Louise Casey has begun her independent review into culture and standards within the MPS. The Right Honourable Dame Elish Angioloni has also started her independent inquiry into the death of Sarah Everard. I fully endorse and support their important work. The Met Police Service itself must develop, with Londoners, an urgent plan to rebuild the trust and confidence of the people they serve, to root out the racism, sexism, homophobia, bullying, discrimination, misogyny that clearly still exists within the force. The recruitment process for the new Commissioner is led by the Home Secretary in consultation with me as Mayor of London. It's important that the community has some role in the appointment process, and I'll be holding discussions with the Home Office as to how this can be achieved. I've been clear with the Home Secretary that the new Commissioner must clearly demonstrate that they understand and accept the scale of the cultural problems within the MPS and the urgency with which they must be addressed. In short, they need to get it, and they need to have a proper and robust plan to deal with it. Part of this must be a clear and deep commitment to working with communities to shape reform. I've been working hard to begin some reform of the MPS along these lines, with community involvement in new recruitment pathways and community-led training for officers. I'll work with the new Commissioner to deepen community involvement in policing as reform of the MPS continues at pace. The need for reform is not simply limited to the MPS. Sir Tom Windsor, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary, has stated this in his recent State of Policing report. There must be a national discussion on policing reform, and this should include consideration of training, misconduct proceedings, whistleblowing structures and the use of social media. Ultimately, the police must be held to account by the public who they serve. As the Police and Crime Commissioner, I'm committed to supporting the police while also challenging them to improve, holding them to account and ensuring Londoners receive the police service they deserve.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now, I'm particularly interested in how Londoners fit in here. People I speak with are shocked and horrified by the continuing stream of disgraceful revelations about the culture in the Met and the behaviour of some officers. And these revelations have just kept coming, and rather than welcoming them as evidence of rooting out the bad apples and even the bad barrels, the communication from the Met has felt defensive, which appears to have worsened trust and confidence. So I think this goes beyond the need to simply change the Commissioner. Now, I understand that you've consulted with a few thousand Londoners out of 10 million on your police and crime plan. But do you agree there's still an urgent need to get Londoners more on board so they can contribute to establishing what policing by consent looks like in a diverse city like London with our inclusive values?
Well, you raise a number of issues, and I know time is short, so I'll try and address them briefly. So, although more than 4,000 responded to the police and crime plan, we consulted widely. And it's really important to understand the impact the top has on the ethos and values of an organisation, including comms from the MPS. And I think what you're highlighting is the need for the new Commissioner to what I call get it. Mm-hmm. And that includes taking on board your concerns that as an experienced elected politician who speaks regularly on a daily basis to Londoners who are concerned. And Londoners, are pro-police, but they need their police to understand there are challenges. We're not a perfect police service, and we need to address that.
Yeah, I mean, we know that there are so many Londoners, black Londoners, LGBT Londoners and women who have lost trust and confidence in a really fundamental way, particularly over these last weeks. Now, earlier on, as well as yesterday at PCC, Assemblymember Moema raised the case of Child Q and the need for the Met to work with local groups like Hackney Account, whose work I've raised with you earlier on in this Assembly term. Now, they've been highlighting the problems with disproportionality in stop and search, let alone strip search. Now, I think you need to be working more with groups like them. Now, in your press release this morning, it said that you and the Commissioner would drive the cultural change and the reforms that are needed. You consulted people on the police and crime plan, but you didn't consult them on reform. Do you agree that we need Londoners to lead a conversation about what policing by consent means in our city?
That's not true, though, is it? I mean, the action plan in the summer that George Floyd was killed was a wide consultation and engagement with community groups across London, including in Hackney. So I think it's important to give credit where it's due. Dr. W. Weeks Bernard, Sophie Linden spent weeks getting across London, speaking to, listening to, engaging with community groups, and the action plan on accountability, transparency and trust in policing was developed after extensive consultation with community groups virtually and in person. I think it does nobody any favours by sweeping generalisations that simply aren't true.
Mr. Mayor, obviously there is good work going on, but I think what I'm talking about is a really sweeping step change in approach to working with the communities in London who have experienced disproportionality, have lost the trust and confidence with the police. We actually, I hope that you see that it isn't just about who leads the Met, but it's about a need to reset that relationship between Londoners and the people who are policing us.
I accept that, and that's one of the reasons why I don't accept is if you're rotten apples or if you're wrong uns. There are deep cultural issues that demand change, and that's one of the reasons, again, the chair of the Met Police Federation may not like it, but that's one of the reasons why I lost confidence in the Commissioner. Well,
thank you. I look forward to that deep conversation with Londoners, because I think it's really needed. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now move to the question in the name of Assembly Member Ahmed around the cost of living crisis.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. I'm extremely concerned about the impact that growing cost of living pressures are having on Londoners, not least because I know how difficult things already are for so many. With inflation set to hit at least 8% this spring, and with 50% rises in energy costs coming in April, more Londoners will face an impossible choice between heating or heating their homes. This crisis poses a significant risk to London's social and economic recovery from the pandemic, and that is before the inflationary impacts of the invasion of Ukraine and the necessary sanctions on Russia are factored in. In next year's budget, I'm investing £3.7 million in work to help raise awareness of financial welfare and debt support and boost the capacity of advice providers to meet demand. This is on top of the £1.7 million I've already invested in partnerships delivering community-based welfare advice through the Robust Safety Net Recovery Mission. I've recently funded Debt Free London to operate their free debt advice helpline 24 hours a day, 7 days a week until the end of May. I'm also helping Londoners reduce their fuel bills and energy debts through my £40 million Warmer Homes programme and the Warmer Homes Advice Service. I'll keep doing all I can, but ultimately the levers to fully address the crisis are at national level. The Chancellor should have used the spring statement yesterday to ensure that welfare benefit payments increase in line with inflation and to scrap the planned increase in national insurance contributions from April. The warm home discount should be extended so that at least everyone who receives universal credit is entitled to it. VAT on energy bills should be reduced immediately, and households should not have to repay the £200 loan while energy bills are still rising. And the government should invest in multi-year energy efficiency programmes to support low-income households to reduce their energy use, which is the only sustainable way to reduce bills in the long term. And to help renters stay in their homes, the government should give me the powers to freeze private rents in London.
Mr Mayor, thank you very much for the answer. I'd like to pick up on something that you've said. You've talked about the choice between heating and eating. I'd like to let you know that we are actually now beyond that as well. That is the reality for many people, but some of my constituents in Lambeth and Southwark have approached me to tell me that as parents, they are now missing out on meals so that they can feed their children. And I know you'll agree with me that that is completely unacceptable in the society we live in today. Mr Mayor, we're seeing the biggest drop in living standards since the 1950s and a spring statement from a Chancellor who chose not to address this. How much impact do you think a 5p reduction in fuel duty, remembering that the average cost at the pump yesterday for a litre of unleaded was £1.67, and a tax cut in 2 years' time will have on Londoners who are struggling to feed their families right now?
Well, firstly, thanks for raising this important issue and giving voice to those who often don't have a voice. It's really important, and if you get a chance, it's worth listening to a caller who rang in LBC yesterday, heartbreaking to listen to, telling the Chancellor just what she was doing to cope, as you said, in the present tense, not future tense. Look, this 5p reduction in fuel duty, which I welcome, the costing increase has gone up more than 5p in the last couple of weeks anyway, number one. Number two, almost half Londoners don't own a car. So this won't help the people who need the help the most. What the Chancellor could have done was to increase welfare benefits by at least inflation. Because if inflation is At the moment, it's 8%. It's going to go to 10% shortly, 10%. But welfare benefits are going up by only 3%. You're already behind in relation to meeting your everyday needs. That's aside from the other challenges you face. And it really is offensive, the response yesterday, bearing in mind the scale of the challenge we face. And I think today's newspapers, let's be frank, newspapers often sympathetic to the party to which the Chancellor belongs, speaks volumes. Usually it takes 3-4 days for a budget to unravel. This one unravelled within minutes.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Let's hope the Chancellor's listening, but I won't hold my breath on that one.
Thank you. We now come to the question 1031 in the name of Assembly Member Baker, and it's in relation to transport in London.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. The spirit and the letter of the GLA Act is clear that it is the democratically accountable Mayor who is responsible for the delivery of transport services in the capital, and it's a responsibility I take very seriously. London's public transport has been revolutionised since TfL was formed in 2000, and responsibility was devolved to the Mayor and the GLA. For the last 2 decades, TfL has been London's transport and spatial planner, system integrator, network manager, regulator, operator and capital delivery body accountable to a democratically elected Mayor. The devolution settlement enabled TfL to create an integrated, modern, affordable network that successfully facilitated the growth of the city from approximately 7 million people in 2000 to over 9 million today, while at the same time making the city more productive and efficient by increasing the share of trips made by public transport, walking and cycling. While historically, transport services in London had been provided by a range of bodies and suffered from underinvestment, TfL has been able to make decisions informed by a clear understanding of the needs of London and deliver benefits beyond simply the provision of transport services. Our model is envied across the globe. But when it comes to funding, we are one of the only capital cities anywhere in the world that doesn't normally receive direct central government operating subsidy. I was working with TfL to make good progress towards self-sufficiency until COVID struck, and a system so heavily reliant on fares left the network dependent on Whitehall funding. The government is saying it wants other parts of the country to have a London-style transport system, and that's right in terms of our integrated transport network that so clearly serves the city's needs. But if we're not careful, even London won't have a London-style transport system. Despite almost 2 years of talks, there are still no answers from the government on a sustainable post-COVID capital funding deal. This political short-termism is not the way to support a multi-billion-pound organisation that is so critical to the capital and the UK as a whole.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think it sounds like I share your concern about the level of interference that have been over the last 2 years through COVID and related to the short-term funding deals in the detail of the operation and planning of London's transport. And I want to ask you a couple of specifics around it. So in the last short-term deal, the government said they were willing to consider a longer capital settlement for TfL for a period of 1 to 3 years, and they were due to provide an outline proposal by today, I believe. Firstly, have you received that proposal yet? And secondly, is it right that decisions to the level of whether we're going to have a DLR extension or whether we're going to buy more electric buses for London are decided effectively in Whitehall and not City Hall?
So no, we've not had the outline offer from the government in relation to the long-term capital deal, whether it's 1 year going up to 3 years or not. But I think you're right. Look, we can't have TfL being micromanaged by the Prime Minister's special advisor. If he wants to run TfL, he should stand for office, right? Not whisper into the ear of the Prime Minister, or by civil servants in the DfT who don't really know how our city runs. And so, I think it's important for them to allow us to run TfL, with a really experienced commissioner who knows what he's doing. And when you compare and contrast what the DfT is doing around the country in some of their projects, I know who I'd rather trust running TfL in London.
Thank you for that. And related to that, we had a recent report from the Transport Committee around the Williams-Shapps and the future of rail and how it affected London. In that recent report, the GLA Conservatives said that they did not believe that now was be the time to devolve mainline rail in London. What do you think of the idea that Whitehall should continue to determine how many trains and the frequency of trains that run in London, not you, as Mayor of London, considering how vital suburban rail is for so many Londoners?
Well, those that have lived in London for some time will have seen the massive improvements made to London Overground since we took over under the franchise system, the running of London Overground. If you remember that East London corridor around Shoreditch, you go to Dalston, you go to Surrey Quays, other parts of London which are benefiting from us running London Overground, but also how we've transformed the suburban line so it's more of a commuter line. And so, I think we could do a good job. I think the current franchise system works. In fact, the Secretary of State wants to use the franchise system for other parts of the country. And so on the one hand, they're emulating and copying what we're doing, but not giving us the promise they made. And by the way, the promise made in 2015 was for us to be given these commuter trains, but the government reneged on that promise well before the pandemic.
Thank you. Thanks, Deputy Chair.
Thank you. There's Assemblymember Garrett waving over there.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So we've just heard about how you're the man who's responsible for transport in London, or ought to be. You'll be aware, I'm sure, today that the Office of Rail and Road have decided to bring a prosecution against Transport for London and against the Tram Operations Limited and the driver in relation to the fatal tram crash in Croydon 6 years ago now, nearly. And what I see and what I hear from people who've been involved in that over that period, in particular from the families, is that I think you and your office have been obstructive and unhelpful in getting to the bottom of that. So I wonder whether you feel that you've done enough to allow the families and their relatives to get to the truth and to get justice about what happened with that crash.
That's not what I've heard from the families in the area affected by Sunderland, and I've got to begin by saying that we obviously remember those who lost their lives as well as those who were injured. So one of the first things that I instructed TfL to do was to admit liability straight away so compensation could be paid speedily rather than wait for judgment before compensation, including interim payments to those families who needed support. The ORR have said they're bringing regulatory proceedings against TfL, against Toll, and also against the driver. I think some of the frustration from the families is the delay in the inquest, but also the driver not giving evidence. In relation to TfL, one of the other things we did is not simply make sure that the families had the support financially, but also had access to the Sarah Hope line, because many of the families are traumatised and grieving. If there are particular complaints that you have against TfL, I'm really happy to take them offline and address them. I'm disappointed if families are unhappy with TfL's response, but they really have responded quickly to issues raised by family members and also those in the community affected. But if there are additional concerns, I'm more than happy to take them away.
I don't think they're additional. I think they're long-standing questions that have been asked by Assembly members, obviously long before my time here, of multiple different parties, about what had gone on, about information that TfL or TOL appeared to have prior to the crash, about some of the problems that were the cause of the crash, and were far less than forthcoming, I would say, quite obfuscating in terms of concealing that information until it eventually came to light. For example, some of it was not included in the original RAIB report because it was not given to RAIB.
No, so all this was explored at the inquest. And,
it wasn't explored in the inquest. The inquest refused to explore it. They said that RAIB had covered it.
All this was explored at the inquest, and TfL disclosed all the documentations to the coroner. I appreciate, there are some activists who've got issues in relation to what was and wasn't disclosed. I think the Deputy Chair has also raised this issue in the past as a consequence of a briefing given to him by an activist. These issues have been looked into by TfL, were looked into by the coroner, and will indeed be looked into by the ORR, as indeed they were by the RAIB. But if there are additional concerns that you want to raise, I'm more than happy to take them away.
Same Stonewall. Thank you, Deputy Chair. I'll leave it there.
Is that a question, Deputy Chair, or just a comment?
I think it was a comment.
So do I.
Mr. Mayor, if we could now move on, please, to the question in the name of Assemblymember Devenish around tube strikes number 1297.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Any strike action on TfL services is regrettable, particularly now as we need a fully functioning transport network to support London's economic recovery from the pandemic. I've been clear that the industrial action we saw on the London Underground at the start of the month was disappointing and frustrating. The action last month was the first network-wide strike to take place since I became mayor in 2016. The previous mayor presided over 5 network-wide strikes. Before the pandemic hit, we'd reduced overall strike action on TfL service by over 70% compared to the previous mayor's record. As the Assembly knows, the pandemic has had a devastating impact on TfL's finances, requiring TfL to carefully consider its financial sustainability due to the huge loss of revenue it has experienced. As part of the funding agreements, the government has not only required TfL to make large-scale savings, but also to commission an independent review of its pension arrangements, which will be published on the 31st of March. It is this pension review that is at the heart of the recent strike action against London Underground. TfL has been engaging with trade unions about how to deliver its financial sustainability plan since early summer 2021. To date, no proposals to change terms and conditions or pension arrangements have been announced, and there are no plans for redundancies. The RMT is currently taking action on the returning night tube services. TfL met with the RMT ahead of the reopening of these services on the Central and Victoria lines and made proposals to resolve the dispute around drivers being rostered to work up to 4 night shifts a year, but these were rejected. Despite this ongoing action by the RMT, TfL has continued to run a good night tube service on the Victoria line and a regular service through Central Line through Central London. I continue to call on the RMT to work with TfL to find solutions to these disputes as soon as possible, preventing further disruption to customers and damage to London's economy at this challenging time.
Mr. Mayor, the network completely shut down on the 1st to the 3rd of March, particularly the Tuesday and the Thursday, and you say it's disappointing. I asked you in my question, what are you going to do to end the tube strike action that's crippling London? You haven't given me an answer. And you said to the previous question, which I actually agreed with for once, that you were responsible for delivering transport in London. So what are you going to do to actually stop more strikes that are crippling London, please?
Well, it's worth reminding the member, because you may not have heard in my answer, the source of concern by the trade union RMT is the condition attached by the government to have a pensions review. That's at the heart of the recent strike action. So that's the source of the grievance, the actions of his government. As far as what we're going to do, what I'm going to do, is to persuade the RMT to talk to TfL to avoid disruptive strike action, not only because it's premature, but because actually it's no good for TfL or getting a recovery back. One of the things he could do to help was to ask his friends in government not to attach onerous conditions that leads to London coming to a standstill because of strike action from the RMT because of their conditions.
Well, I agree with you, they've used the excuse of the pensions review, but they also said it was to do with pay and other conditions. You haven't mentioned that at all. And talking about pay, you've just given them an 8.4% pay rise. What do you think Londoners that have had their days destroyed, so they couldn't get to work, they couldn't do the other things they need to do, that you have given this very militant union an 8.4% pay rise?
Here we have it. The cat is out of the bag. Anti-trade union Tories using any excuse to bash workers organising collectively to negotiate from their employers. Let me be quite clear. 4 years ago, we reached a deal with the transport trade unions. And that 4-year deal was a multi-year deal. What he's suggesting is that we should tear up that contract in year 4 because of two circumstances that were
No, Mr. Mayor, what I'm suggesting is you should actually allow Londoners to go to work or play with transport actually working. You are the Mayor of London, you are the Chair of Transport for London. Can you please stop these strikes?
Well, this tub-thumping, typical right-wing anti-trade unionism is what we expect from the Tory party. But if I could be allowed
and anti-Londoners is what we expect from the Labour Party.
Rude, hectoring Tories. Let me respond to the question raised now, if I can.
You should know about rudeness.
He doesn't like it, does he, when you go for him? But let me be quite clear. Anti-trade unionism is what the Tories believe. It's in their DNA. I'm quite clear. When you make a deal, you stick by it. And we made a deal 4 years ago, and the deal was quite clear, a multi-year deal. And let me be quite clear, the consequence of what he's saying. What he's saying is you can't trust the Tories on a deal. Because if the Tories reach a deal with you, they will tear it up when it suits them. Because what he's advocating is to throw in the bin to tear up a deal made 4 years ago. Why would anybody in good faith reach an agreement with a Conservative politician where they're simply going to ignore it? And that's one of the reasons why we have across the country so much unhappiness with a government that is willing to not just break the law when it comes to parties in Downing Street.
Chair, this is him wasting my time. The reality is he has no plan to end the strikes, as always, so I'll leave it there.
You sure?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think on that note, as we are approaching 11:30, and I don't know if I can stand the excitement of another one back to back, we will call a break, and if we could all get back by 5:22, please. 11:35. Well, no, I don't.
Could you bring the gavel from the webcast, please?
Pardon? Members, if you can take your seats, please.
We're not Tony enough, are we? Humility, isn't it?
Right, that's it then. I'm going. We now start the second session. I call on Assembly Member Fortune's question, which is 1276, about the impact of ULEZ expansion and road charging.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. I've asked TfL to consult on expanding the ultra-low emission zone London-wide to extend the huge air quality benefits of the scheme. Whilst I've done a great deal to clean up London's air over the last 6 years and support poor Londoners to make the transition, there are still nearly 4,000 premature deaths a year linked to poor air quality, with the majority of those in outer London. Crucially, there's been a slower rate of improvement in air quality in outer London, where 300,000 people have asthma, than in inner London. The ULEZ is getting the most polluting vehicles off our streets, and early assessments indicate that extending it London-wide would lead to a further reduction of around 10% in NOx emissions from cars and vans in outer London, improving on the 30% reduction expected from the expanded ULEZ and tighter low emission zone standards. Expanding London-wide would also reduce carbon dioxide emissions in outer London and further reduce the number of most polluting cars on London's roads. The rising cost of living was a key consideration for me in making the decision to move ahead to consultation on the proposal. At a time when people's budgets are under pressure, I'm not willing to ask people to pay more unless I'm absolutely convinced it's justified to protect the health of Londoners. By using the polluter pays principle to target the scheme on the most harmful journeys, this is the scheme that will provide the biggest improvement in health with the smallest impact on Londoners' pockets. Nearly half of Londoners don't own a car. This is also a matter of social justice, as low-income Londoners who bear the brunt of toxic emissions are the least likely to own one. What's more, thanks to improvements in technology and the wider influence of the existing ULEZ, 82.5% of cars in outer London are already ULEZ compliant, meaning their owners would not be subject to any additional charge. I'm also proposing to introduce the biggest scrappage scheme feasible to help Londoners on low incomes, disabled Londoners, charities and businesses. The £61 million we provided for scrappage associated with the existing ULEZ was provided entirely without government support, in contrast to other UK cities which have received millions from the government. I'd welcome the member support in making the case to government to provide funding for a scrappage scheme to support Londoners in this time around.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I phrased the question very carefully. So for the benefit of the tape, I recognise that there's the air quality improvements that you're driving for, but the question was specifically about the financial impact, and I did word that in the question. Just so you know, I spoke with TfL on Monday, and they're going to come back with some modelling about the air quality in outer London. I want to do my homework, and I want to understand it. So it's the financial impact that I want to focus in. And the question asks, how will you ensure that the financial impact of these schemes does not hit the poorest the hardest?
Well, there'll be an integrated impact assessment which will look into the sort of issues we're talking about, the equality and economic impacts. And I can ask the TfL to also brief you on that as well. It's similar to the assessment we did, obviously a different area, in relation to both the central and inner London ULEZ, looking into a whole host of issues which TfL can explain to you. And that's one of the reasons to address any adverse economic consequences. We would have the widest possible scrappage scheme, and why in my answer I asked for your help in relation to persuading the government not to treat London differently, not to be anti-London, and give us some of the support they give in other parts of the country to ameliorate some of the consequences economically to those who may suffer adversely because of ULEZ expanding.
So I'll advocate for my residents wherever that needs to happen. So around those financial impacts, residents have been in touch with me. This is a really big issue of concern for them, as it was when there was the extension to the North and South Circular that we talked about. They're really worried about how it's going to impact them visiting friends and family, getting to work. Small businesses that run maybe a fleet of diesel vehicles, they're concerned because the scrappage scheme ran out of money last time, so they're really concerned to make sure it doesn't happen this time. You mentioned, I think, into an answer to one of our colleagues here about half of Londoners not owning a car. Which half don't own a car?
So, on average, if you look at all of London, around half of Londoners don't own a car. And to give you credit, to be fair, the Conservatives have been consistently opposed to ULEZ, consistently opposed to Central London ULEZ. You've been opposed to in London ULEZ, and we're not surprised you're opposed to outer London ULEZ as well. So you have been consistent.
I'm quite clear in relation to Mike being consistently in favour of cleaning up the air in our city. It is an issue of social justice. Those in outer London suffer more deaths caused by poor air quality. They're older Londoners, but also are more likely to have asthma than those in central London. Just because we're going into the polemic here. So the reason I asked about that, which half of London... It's a fact. No, well, it isn't. So which half of London? Camden, 34%. In outer London, more people suffer adverse consequences from air quality. I really worded the question carefully to ask about the financial impact in terms of the expanded zone.
Well, no, you said it wasn't a fact. It is a fact, though, isn't it? Do you accept now? Do you accept it is a fact? Those in outer London
structured my supplementaries to ask specifically about the expansion into outer London.
So you said it wasn't a fact. It is a fact, isn't it?
When I asked about, the question was which half...
It is a fact.
The question was which half...
It's Mayor's question
time. If we look to Camden, you're right, Camden, there's 34% car ownership. Hackney, there's 33% car ownership. Islington, there's 32% car ownership. You go to outer London, Bexley, there's 74% car ownership. Bromley, there's 75% car ownership. 75% in Havering, 74% in Kingston upon Thames, 77% in Sutton. These are figures from the Centre of London report. So, you know, London is different, and that's in different parts of London, and that's a case that's been made over and over again. So when ULEZ expands out to cover the whole of London, it's not the case, which is the implied suggestion, that not many people out there own cars. It's different. There is a different makeup in outer London to inner London. Okay? That comes from these figures here. You said a couple of times now that, again, the poorest in London don't own cars. Where do you get that data from? Because I've been looking very carefully for that data.
Okay, you've had 3 minutes to ask your question. I hope you give me the courtesy to have at least 3 minutes to answer.
If you could ask the question I asked, that would be very useful.
So, one of the reasons why those in outer London suffer worse in relation to the consequences of air quality is they're older, and as you said, there may be more air pollution caused by the numbers of cars there. On average, the car ownership in London is around half, and that's leading to the premature deaths I've been talking about. One of the reasons why we are increasing bus services in outer London is because we want to improve public transport in outer London, which for too long has benefited from less good public transport. One of the reasons, for example, we were keen to have step-free access in Harrow on the Hill was so that outer London could have the benefits of people being able to use public transport. It is a fact, though, you may not like it, I don't like it, but outer London suffers worse consequences from air pollution. We have more outer Londoners.
I put it right at the beginning of this, the caveat that this is separating air quality from financial impact.
I wasn't given 3 minutes.
No, separating
to be fair, to be fair, Mr. Mayor, he's quite specific on his question. I think we've given you quite a lot of lenience in relation to talking about air quality, but you're talking about air quality, but the question is quite clear, and if you could either address your answer...
I'm happy to phrase the question again in case the Med if you wouldn't mind, Assemblyman, which is that you've said previously that the poorest in London do not own cars, and my question is, because I've looked through it, I'm trying to find that data, where do you source that data from?
So trying to be clear, so you're implying the poorest do own cars?
No, I'll ask again, just for your clarity. You've said many times that the poorest in London don't have cars. Implication being that when there's an expanded ULEZ zone, they won't be impacted by it in terms of the financial impact. I'm asking, I've gone to look for that data. I'm struggling to find that data. Where do you get that data from? Well, I want to understand your thinking.
I am surprised that the member's experience of being an elected politician doesn't lead him to conclude that the poorest Londoners can't afford to own cars. I will send him evidence backing up.
I'll go and get it myself. Where does it come from?
I will send him not just my own experience of this, but examples to show that nearly half all households in London.
I don't need examples. I think it's a clearly phrased and respectful question. Actually, I'm not disputing you. I'm asking you where you got that data from, so I can go and have a look at it myself.
I think, Mr. Mayor, and I probably wouldn't expect you to know it off the top of your head, but he's asking for the source. Mr. Mayor, asking for the source.
I was surprised by the proposition that poor people are less likely to own a car.
You made that proposition. I said that I didn't make that. I've asked you very clearly where you get your data from, so I can go and study it and have a look at it.
So I'm surprised by that supposition. I will make sure that officials in TfL give him the data. Maybe he should knock on a few more doors and get around London a bit more
in relation to...
So what does that mean? You see, that was just a dig. That was a dig because you feel awkward. Now, if you don't have the data, you can tell me you don't have that to hand, and I will have it. But you don't need to make digs like that. It's unbecoming of the office. No, I've spoken with the ONS.
Johnson supporter.
See, again, unbecoming of the office. I asked a respectful question, and if you feel awkward...
Well, the Deputy Chair's going to give me a chance to respond. Give me a chance to respond,
then that's fine. You're not responding to the question I'm asking. So if you could send me... So you said over and over again that the poorest in London don't have cars, the suggestion and the implication being that when the ULEZ expands out, that they won't be impacted by it. So I'm saying, OK, let me see where that data is, because I'd quite like to see where you're setting the mark of poorest as well. So you've agreed to send me that data, and I look forward to receiving it. Thank you, Deputy Chair.
I look forward to many conversations to explain to the member about poverty and the link between poor households.
That's absurd, again, and frankly insulting, and ignorant of my background, actually, Mr Mayor.
Right. I'm going to now call a halt to this, actually, and say that, Mr Mayor, if you can just be just a little bit more respectful of members, it would be greatly appreciated. I can understand where you're coming from, but also you have to understand where other people are coming from as well. So
I'm happy to take guidance from you how in a respectful way I can help the member have more experience of poor Londoners' experience.
Again, that's absolutely absurd and ignorant of my background, and you need to behave more in standing with your office.
Says a Boris Johnson supporting Tory member.
It's like a playground and a silly school bully.
I'm not going to allow this to decline into a playground, frankly. I think both members need to sort of heighten the level of debate here.
I think he's the member, I'm the mayor.
Yeah, Mr Mayor, you just have to stop making those little crypts. It doesn't become the office, it really doesn't. OK, so we're going to move now on to Assembly Member Cooper's question, which is 1059, which is about the London-wide ULEZ expansion.
Actually, Deputy Chair, I didn't...
Oh, I do apologise, yes. In all the excitement,
I know.
I overlooked the fact that I've got it written down here that you did ask a supplementary.
I did, thank you.
This is not your question, this is your supplementary on this.
Well, yes, I mean, I won't go back to exactly where we got to in that particular discussion, but I did wonder, you know, obviously one of the ways in which London has been treated unfairly compared to the rest of the country is we have a National Clean Air Fund, which has had a pretty paltry amount of money put into it by the government, in my view. And London, which I think we've all agreed that the measurement of London air is, you know, that it is toxic, it is filthy, the gases, the particulate matter, it does need to be cleaned up. You've come forward with concrete proposals that actually build originally the first ULEZ on the suggestion from that bloke we were just talking about, the previous mayor. But of course, you know, it is essential that the expansion of the ULEZ and what we're doing is fair to all Londoners in terms of, as much as possible, the financial side of things, which is what Assemblymember Fortune was raising, rather than just looking at the congestion or the health side of things. How important is it that we are given more support in London, like all the other parts of the country, where they are trying to step up and tackle poor air? They are following in our wake, but they are being given more help than we are. Isn't that the case?
Yes, when you look at the clean air zones around the country, the government has provided support to Manchester, Birmingham, Bath, Bristol, Coventry, Bradford, Portsmouth, no support to London. And it is important London gets support. On the one hand, members from the Conservative Party claim to understand poverty but aren't willing to lobby their government for support towards a scrappage scheme. What I'd encourage them to do is, rather than posturing or cheap possible points, but to lobby the government for support towards a scrappage scheme. It's really important we receive support.
Mr Mayor, you put 61 million in total into the previous scrappage schemes in preparation for the October 21 expansion to the North and South Circular. How helpful would it really be if we are going to go ahead in 2023 with the expansion to the whole of Greater London to have that support for those very Londoners that Assemblymember Fortune was just referring to?
Well, I'm not sure who he was referring to be honest. But the £61 million from TfL
zero from the government.
Zero. Yeah.
Took 15,500 cars, the most polluting cars, off our street. He's not met poorer Londoners, but I'm sure we can take him around some of our estates. To meet
is that a point of personal order, isn't it?
Don't own a vehicle, but are suffering the worst.
What's the evidence? It's absurd.
I mean, I sat.
Sorry,
with...
Assembly Member Cooper. The member is asking for a point of personal explanation, which he's quite entitled to do, as he's been.
Sorry, he wasn't named.
No, it doesn't have to be named. It was a very. Sorry, excuse me. I'm chairing this meeting. It was very clear who the Mayor was indicating to and was referring to. So, under the standing orders, the Assembly Member has the right to a personal point of explanation. So, Assembly Member Fortune.
The Mayor has bizarrely referenced me a few times now, saying that I have no experience with the poorest Londoners. I'd like to know on what he bases that assertion.
Was that the explanation or a question?
I think that is a question.
Will that use up his time?
You can answer the question, or you can not answer the question.
No, I'm not going to bother.
You. Unbelievable.
Why are you not going to bother? You're scared, you're fricked. Is that the problem?
Surely a point of personal explanation is for the Assembly Member to explain himself.
Being accused of being a frit is not unbecoming of a member.
I'm actually quoting you back, funnily enough. Yeah. I remember you saying it to my colleague to my left. You can't keep going away with these bully boy tactics. It's unbecoming.
Right, being lectured about unbecoming by a Conservative is news to me.
I'm going to... Assembly Member, did you want to make any more clarity on your point of personal explanation?
I don't think I'll bother.
No, I think he's said enough, hasn't he?
Thank you. Then, sorry, Assembly Member Cooper, if you'd like to continue your questions.
I think I'd like to move on to my actual question now, if I may, Chair. Thank you.
In that case, I would now like to put to you, Mr Mayor, the question by Assembly Member Cooper, number 1059, around London-wide ULEZ expansion.
Can I thank the member for her support on our policies to clean up air and her pushing of me to go even further. I know she takes real interest in her constituents, particularly the poorer ones who live in Wandsworth and Merton, many of whom, for obvious reasons, don't own a car. They're really struggling to choose between putting food on the table and heat for their homes. She will know the poorest Londoners, least likely to own a car, suffer the worst consequences of air pollution in relation to premature deaths, in relation to asthma, in relation to heart disease, in relation to cancer, in relation to lung disease, and other issues. And the problems aren't caused by them, they're owned by often people who own cars who are much wealthier than them. We've done a number of things over the last few years, all of them in this area opposed by the Conservatives to clean up the air in London. They opposed the ultra-low emission zone in central London, which you supported. They opposed the ultra-low emission zone in inner London. And unsurprisingly, they're now opposing the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone to cover all of London. The good news is, because of our policies, the number of non-compliant vehicles has gone down. The number of compliant vehicles has gone up from 39% when we first announced these policies and they opposed it, to now approaching 93% in the expanded zone across the entire London, 82.5%. And I'm confident that our policies will make further progress, which is why we're going to consult on them from May.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor, and I think the direction of travel has been clear. What do you see as being the key health benefits of the gradual expansion from Central to North and South Circular and then out across the whole of London?
So what we've seen first in Central London and then in London is a huge improvement in air. So in Central London, the amount of toxic air reduced by almost a half, nitrogen dioxide by 44%, particulate matter by around 27%, carbon emissions by around 5%. Going to inner London leads to further improvements, but the improvements in outer London have been less good than central and inner London. And actually those who are least likely to own a car in outer London, often the poorest, suffer the worst consequences. And what we're trying to do is to ensure that clean air is a human right rather than a privilege. And it's really important that we begin consultation in May so we can see all Londoners benefiting from clean air rather than just those who are lucky enough to live in central or inner London.
I mean, I've compared access to clean air as being something similar to access to clean water, and I think it should be the right of all Londoners to have access to that. We were just talking about the impact on trying to persuade people away from individual car ownership towards the Mayor transport strategy of 80% of journeys being done by active travel or on public transport. The scrappage scheme is obviously something that we've just touched on, and I think that's really important. But also car clubs, I think, is another way of persuading people to move away from individual vehicle ownership. It may then be a stepping stone into them getting rid of a vehicle altogether. But in outer London, I think people do feel the need sometimes, because journeys can be longer, to still have access to a vehicle. Would you agree with me that car clubs as well as scrappage?
Car clubs are real innovation over the last few years. I mean, they've been around for some time, but their increase is really good, because sometimes you will need a car.
Sure.
And having the ability to get a car from a car club means you can give up the car you own, save a lot of money in relation to the cost of running a car, still have access to a car. So the scrappage scheme will help getting the most polluting vehicles off the road, help make the transition. But the proximity and availability of a car club will make you less nervous about no longer owning a car. And you're right, both go together, the scrappage schemes and the increasing the availability of cars from a car club.
Given the cost of living crisis that I think we're now experiencing, and unfortunately the failure of the Chancellor yesterday, as you said, to come forward with any concrete proposals to help those who are the least well off, how important is scrappage in that context?
Well, it's really important. I mean, I know from being a Londoner and spending time with people from all backgrounds that actually poorer Londoners, least likely to own a car, won't benefit from a 5p fuel duty cut. And I'm happy to send the evidence to members who don't realise that if they need the evidence. But also we know in the last couple of weeks, fuel use gone up by more than 5p anyway. And so it's really important to make sure there are policies to help the poorest Londoners, and yesterday was a missed opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We now move to the question in the name of Assembly Member Best. It's 1196 and it's regarding stop and search.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Stop and search is an important tool for the police, particularly in the fight against violence. The MPS has my support in using these powers to keep us safe, provided they're used lawfully, proportionally and with professionalism. The primary purpose of stop and search, as set out by the College of Policing, is to enable officers to allay or confirm suspicions about individuals without exercising their power of arrest. In London, the positive outcomes rate for all stop and search, which include cautions, charges and arrests, is 27%. This is a 5% increase since 2020 and the highest it's been since 2018. In 2021 alone, 4,816 weapons were seized as a result of stop and searches. Every seizure removing a potentially deadly weapon from our streets. However, the debate around stop and search goes beyond these statistics. As I made clear in my action plan for transparency, accountability and trust in policing, I recognise the disproportionate impact stop and search can have on some communities, and that it's vital that the MPS has the trust and confidence of all Londoners. The Met Police Service has committed to improving its practices and has put in place a commander-led monthly gold group to provide strategic direction and the governance for lead officers and key stakeholders. It has implemented enhanced training, which includes greater community involvement, lived experience sessions and unconscious bias training. The MPS has also strengthened the supervision of stop and search, which already required supervisors to review stop and search records, with the addition of live observations of officers using their powers in public and quarterly reviews of officers' body-worn video footage. Learning is then fed back to officers to improve their practice. My Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime scrutinises the monthly data and raises any concerns with senior officers. At the local level, community monitoring groups also regularly dip sample stop and search records and body-worn video. There have been 91 body-worn video review sessions since September 2020. I'm committed to strengthening community oversight, and work is underway to overhaul community monitoring structures to ensure they're effective. I'm not complacent and understand that stop and search, when done badly, can deeply impact individuals and communities. I'm committed to ensuring the Met Police Service continues to be supported and held to account for fairly and effectively policing the capital, while using its powers effectively to keep Londoners safe.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Would you agree with me that one of the main functions of Stop and Search should be to reduce youth violence?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I mean, one of the things that I find slightly concerning is that the use of Stop and Search, since the beginning of your mayoralty, the amount of Stop and Search leading to finding a weapon has decreased by almost 27%. And it's already a very low number before your mayoralty, and after 2.6% down to 1.9%. I mean, the good news, as you would say, is that the rate of finding weapons, the positive outcomes of a search is going up, but that rate is falling. We know that the use of Stop and Search has fallen, and so the amount of weapons off the street as a result of Stop and Search has fallen.
I think that's a fair summary. That's one of the reasons why we're involving the community more in relation to use of Stop and Search and improving police training, but I think that's a fair concern you've articulated in your question.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. And the other question I had was to focus really on finding weapons. We know that obviously Stop and Search is very invasive, and there has been some talk of scan and search technology, especially on the TfL network. There was a pilot of this in 2019. However, what I wanted to ask you was what you thought of scan and search technology, but I don't think that would be a very fair question because there's never been a review or any analysis of that pilot. So would you please look to get some analysis of that to see if it's a useful tool that we could use?
Yeah, so you're right about the practice with experience with TfL. So look, one of the issues in relation to the body scanning technology is you've seen the stuff at the airports. It's not realistic to have that sort of technology on the streets, but also some of the practical issues. If you imagine the disruption to a street, the congestion it caused people in relation to if there was that on a street, but also how do you, using that technology in relation to metal detectors, manage to stop somebody carrying a bag of cocaine who's using it to supply and so forth. So we do look at the evidence. We look at what happens around the country and around the world, but there is going to still be a need for Stop and Search. But you're right, we should also be looking at whether there's new technology. The body scanners we're using in schools now more and more. We're using the arches more and more. What it does often do is lead to people avoiding the arches and so forth. But I think all these things are going to be kept under review, including looking at what works around the country and around the globe.
Thanks. Will you take that away to try and get some analysis of that 2019 pilot?
I've got a feeling that's just a memory that there was some. Can I go away and if there was, I'll provide it to you. If there isn't, I'll find out why. Because I just think there was, but I've not got it in my briefing, if that's okay.
Okay. In an answer to an earlier mayoral question, there was a confirmation there is none. But
I'm not saying you're wrong, but
no. But if we could look into it, at least I think it's worth. If we do a pilot, we should have some understanding.
Yeah, I think it was BTP and TfL, Deputy Chair, but can I take that away?
It was a combined effort involving the Home Office too. And
I may be misremembering.
And just finally, as you mentioned it briefly, knife ones, the funding from MOPAC has fallen off for knife ones, and so I actually went away and spoke to some schools because I wondered, has that fallen apart? Because they're not actually that expensive, the spending isn't that high, so I wondered, is it because schools don't want to use them? And I got a positive response from many schools, so could we perhaps look to rolling out knife ones further to those schools that are interested?
Yeah, so I'm really happy to respond to this because we did a lot of work, and Sophie Linden and Lib Peck did a lot of work in relation to saying to schools, you working with the police and having knife ones doesn't mean you'll get a bad reputation. It's a safeguarding issue, and it's changing the mindset of heads who may think they're worried about their school being labelled, inverted commas. We know we wouldn't do this, but you know, a bad school because there are school officers, knife ones. That conversation is carrying on with the VRU, but I'm more than happy, Deputy Chair, for Lib to write to the member. There has been some progress made. I've got to be honest, the Child Q case may lead to some retrenchment in relation to the progress we've made, but I'm happy to take that away and respond to you.
Thank you. Could I now look to Assembly Member Rogers' question, which is 1239, and that is the name in regards to crime against London's LGBT plus community.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. The findings of the recent inquest into the victims of Stephen Port were shocking and have deeply impacted the LGBTQ plus community. In response, I asked Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Services to conduct an independent inspection into the MPS investigations. I've also met with Baroness Casey, whose review into the culture of the MPS includes looking at issues of misogyny, sexism, racism and homophobia.
Public trust in the police has been severely damaged and must be urgently rebuilt. I'll ensure the MPS is held to account on its work to improve inclusion, diversity and engagement through its Strategy for Inclusion, Diversity and Engagement, or STRIDE. Regular programme boards chaired by the Assistant Commissioner for Professionalism are attended by senior MOPAC officers and my Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, who holds 6 weekly bilateral meetings with the Assistant Commissioner where progress against the STRIDE strategy is discussed. The 12 months to February 2022 saw a 30% increase in reports of sexual orientation-linked hate crimes, and the MPS has taken steps to improve its response to hate crime. MPS hate crime outcomes and performance officers in every BC work with victims most at risk of hate crime, focusing on improving investigations and ensuring victims are referred for appropriate support. Over 100 MPS LGBTQ+ advisors engage with the relevant communities, offering internal learning and development and provide community reassurance, building trust and confidence to report hate crime. In light of the Port inquest findings, the MPS and its LGBTQ+ independent advisory group are currently undertaking a review of the LGBTQ+ advisor role. I've also increased investment to ensure the LGBTQ+ victims can access the right support. This includes over £1 million throughout 2021-2022 and 2022-23 to provide support for LGBTQ+ victims of domestic and sexual violence, including specialist support for LGBTQ+ victims staying in safe accommodation to help them rebuild their lives. In October 2021, I launched a new hate crime victim service. This £1 million service ensures that all victims of hate crime in London can access specialist support that best meets their needs. And last week I announced a new £11.3 million fund for domestic abuse services, which will support LGBTQ+ victims as well as others.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your answers. Now, there's a few things you mentioned I'll touch on. You started off talking about the Stephen Port case. And it's clear that that has had a significant impact on trust and confidence in the police among London's LGBT community. And we actually had a Transport Committee visit to Barking recently, and I arrived a little early, and I went to St Margaret's Church to pay my respects to Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth and Jack Taylor. And I'm afraid, whilst I was there, standing at that church, I felt sadness and also a deep feeling of anger about the failings of the Met Police investigation. And you mentioned the coroner's report, and the coroner's report says that there are failings that came out in the hearings that were not identified in the original IOPC investigation. The IOPC are currently reviewing whether they need to reopen that investigation, as I'm sure you know, and they're due, I think overdue, in fact, to announce whether or not they will be reopening. I have written to them asking them to reopen that investigation. Will you add your voice to that? Will you ask them to reopen the investigation as well?
Firstly, let me just say that the feelings you feel and felt are not dissimilar, as you know, from the feelings felt by not just the family and friends of the 4 victims of Stephen Port, but other members of the LGBTQ+ community. I know Unmesh Desai has raised this a number of matters because of his experience in that part of London for obvious reasons. We have raised it with the IPC, as is the Deputy Mayor. I'm happy, though, to get an update from them in relation to them, because you're right, the evidence at the inquest should prompt them into reviewing their original findings, but I'm more than happy to provide you with an update subsequent to this meeting, even if it's in offline.
Thank you. I would appreciate that. Moving to another topic, you mentioned the additional £11.3 million that will be supporting domestic abuse victims. Could you go into a bit more detail about how that will specifically be used to help LGBT domestic abuse victims?
Of course I can. Thank you for your interest. So some of the money is going to go towards Gallup to provide pan-London support through a caseworker. Some of the money is going to Stonewall Housing for the provision of housing information, advice and support through every step of the LGBTQ+ victim journeys, the victim/survivor's journey, through every step from crisis through to recovery, ensuring they're able to live independently and can rebuild their lives. I'm more than happy to write to him to give him how much money is going to each group, but we were keen to make sure that some of the money is ring-fenced for this community for obvious reasons.
Thank you. I'd appreciate that breakdown. And during the pandemic, MOPAC provided emergency accommodation for LGBT domestic abuse victims, and I believe there are actually 129 referrals for 4 bed spaces, so clear need there. Is there any plans to resurrect that service?
Yeah, so we did provide the emergency services during the pandemic, and we did get assistance from the Home Office as well. I've not got that briefing. Again, can I take that away and come back to you? I don't want to mislead unintentionally, and so if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I now have a question in the name of Assembly Member Clark, 1054, which is support and resilience for Ukraine.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. And can I thank you for your question? From the beginning of Putin's war of aggression, London has stood shoulder to shoulder with the people of Ukraine, and we will continue to do so as the situation develops. The Ukraine situation has not changed London's threat level, but my Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience has taken a prudent approach and convened meetings of the London Resilience Forum to work through London's risk register. These meetings have developed a set of London-specific planning assumptions to aid partners with their own preparedness. My officers are working closely with government officials to ensure that our assessment remains up to date and reflective of any changes to the situation. I have met with the ambassador from Ukraine to the UK and his deputy to discuss the deepening crisis and extend the offer of assistance on behalf of all Londoners and highlight the need for safe passage of Ukrainian refugees. Officers in the Deputy Mayor's resilience team and across the GLA have been working with contacts at the embassy and with the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities to deliver what assistance we can. One of the major asks from the Ukrainian embassy to Londoners is for help in the form of financial rather than physical donations. I commissioned a new webpage on london.gov.uk with information about how to donate to reputable charities supporting both the humanitarian effort in Ukraine and Ukrainians in London. I encourage Londoners to continue to show their generosity in this way. Partners from across the London Resilience Partnership have also shown their generosity, donating specific pieces of kit to support the crisis in Ukraine. London Fire Brigade have been able to donate vital firefighting and rescue equipment, and 3 of their firefighters from the International Search and Rescue Team are driving vehicles as part of a convoy delivering fire and rescue kit and equipment to the Polish State Fire Service. This Saturday at 2 p.m, Londoners can show their solidarity with Ukraine by joining me and others at the London Stands with Ukraine march from Park Lane to Trafalgar Square.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Mayor. Can I start with echoing your warm welcome to Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who lives in my constituency, and just how wonderful it is to see her reunited with her family in West Hampstead. I'm just coming back to my original question. Your Smarter London Together roadmap says that you are looking into the viability of creating a shared cybersecurity operations centre for London. Can you update me on this work and what challenges we are facing related to cybersecurity at the moment?
Well, without going into details for obvious reasons, I work very closely with the government, who've been incredibly collegiate in relation to potential threats to our city caused by Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and that includes clearly cybersecurity. So both the private sector but also organisations like TfL are well aware of potential cyber threats. And it's important for me to reassure you and reassure Londoners that working closely with the government, we're doing what we can to avoid the possibility of any threats to our cyber caused by attacks from Putin's Russia. That includes clearly cybersecurity. For obvious reasons, we can't really talk about it publicly.
Thank you. And just going back to the cost of living crisis, which we've discussed many times today, and because it's so important to London, I'm worried that some Londoners, let alone affording a car, are unable to cook the food that they receive from food banks. I mean, I think we are at that point where that is the reality, where food banks are considering the type of food they're giving out because they wonder if those receiving it are going to be able to afford to cook it. And I'm just wondering, I mean, with the war, energy prices going up, transportation costs looking set to soar, what are you doing to assess the potential impacts of the war on Londoners, such as higher food prices and higher cost of living?
Well, I've got to be frank in relation to the limitations of my power and resources in this area. One of the things we've got to do is to make sure we ensure the government, and maybe some members of this Assembly, know the experiences of ordinary Londoners when it comes to poverty. and making choices, not about what car they have, they don't own a car, but in relation to choosing between turning the heating on, putting food on the table, making a choice to go to work when they may have COVID because they're in a 0 hours contract, and so forth. And this is before national insurance goes up. This is before the 54% increase in energy prices. This is before, as you said, the consequences of any sanctions against Russia really biting, caused by the invasion of Putin's Russia in Ukraine. And that's why you've seen the outroar over the last 24 hours after the Chancellor's budget. It's just, tone deaf to some of the additional challenges that are just around the corner. That's why it's really important that we do what we can with the limited resources to provide debt advice 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We don't want people going to loan sharks, but also to make sure people are applying for the benefits they're eligible to get in relation to the advice we give. It's really important, even though the benefits won't go up at the same level as the inflation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right, so the next question in the name of Assembly Member Polanski is being withdrawn. So that now brings us to the question by Assembly Member Desai, 1079, in relation to money laundering in London.
Thank you, Chair. I've been clear that much more needs to be done to tackle international money laundering by oligarchs allied to Putin. The MPs collaborate with the National Crime Agency and the Serious Fraud Office, which lead on tackling economic crime. However, to be able to respond effectively, both organisations require a major funding boost from the government. The government must also set out plans for the seizure of property belonging to those with the closest ties to Putin, including creating a stronger legislative framework. I welcome the fact that ministers are finally progressing the economic crime bill to target money laundering by Russian oligarchs, but too many loopholes remain. I've been calling on the government for years to introduce a register of overseas property ownership to clamp down on London being used for international money laundering, to help law enforcement tackle the flood of dirty money we've seen come to the UK. The MPS Economic Crime Command was created in 2019 to deliver a more effective response across all forms of financial crime. This new model has seen some success. Cash seizures rose from £560 million in 1920 to £734 million in 2020 and 2021. And account freezing orders issued rose as well, from 184 to 336. The MPs is making good progress, but we need a funding boost for both the National Crime Agency and the Serious Fraud Office, as well as for changes in the law as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I got most of what you said, but I got three supplementary questions. So in July 2020, the Intelligence Security Committee of Parliament presented its report on Russia, which predicted unexplained wealth orders would fail due to underfunding of the National Crime Agency. They felt that the orders, whilst appearing to give the NCA more clout, the reality was that it was highly probable that the oligarchy would have financial means to ensure that lawyers would find ways to circumvent the legislation. By contrast, the National Crime Agency itself lacked resources in terms of financial investigations, technical expertise, and legal expertise, and they felt that this must be rectified. Mr. Mayor, do you agree with them? And do you agree with me in my campaign to clean up the city, which falls in my constituency, that we need more resources for the NCA and the Met, as well as legislative changes?
Absolutely. I mean, the lack of unexplained wealth orders should be a source of concern. None have been obtained since the end of 2019, and we've been calling for a beneficial owner register. That would let us know who owns the property. What excuse could there be for using shell companies registered in tax havens? And that's why we need the transparency. David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, remember him? He promised this in 2016. Nothing 6 years on.
Yes, I do remember David Cameron. Mr. Mayor, my second supplementary, again, is about unexplained wealth orders. So there was much hope that these orders would go some way towards acting as a deterrent for those who seek to invest, quote, dirty money into the UK through buying up properties in London. These orders have unfortunately had very little success, and the government is now proposing to overhaul them as part of the economic crime bill. Are you confident that this overhaul will result in stronger action?
Not unless they close the loopholes, not unless there's sufficient resources for the NCA and the Serious Fraud Office. In your first question, you talked about the resources these oligarchs close to Putin has. It's not a level playing field. And so the government needs to back up any legislative changes with closing the loopholes and giving the resources to the SFO and NCA that they need.
And Mr. Mayor, my final question. So sanctions, and we have 65 more announced today, including one against the Russian foreign minister's stepdaughter, who reportedly owns a £4 million house in London. And legislation now is, of course, welcome, but schemes like the now-ended Golden Visa scheme and politicians fraternizing with oligarchs, described by Liz Truss as having Ukrainian blood in their hands, surely send out the wrong message as we begin the long overdue process of cleaning up the city.
Yes, spot on. What we can't be doing is giving credibility to oligarchs close to Putin, and it's really important. We act as one in this, government, City Hall and others as well, and the government's got to stop London being seen as a money laundering capital for these people, and it's really important actions taken. Transparency International estimate £1.1 billion worth of property in London is owned by people like the ones we're concerned about.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. The next question is in the name of Assembly Member Pigeon. Unfortunately, your group is out of time. So we move then to the question by Assembly Member Moema, which is 1107, regarding the Russian invasion of the Ukraine.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. For far too long, ministers have turned a blind eye to the use of our capital's homes as a safe harbour for oligarchs to park their cash, which is having a negative impact on both our international reputation and our local housing market. As I said in answer to a question from Assembly Member Desai, Transparency International estimate that £1.1 billion worth of London properties owned by individuals accused of corruption in Russia or with links to the Kremlin. Seizing this property would hurt Putin's allies and could provide a means of support for the victims of his war. But as things stand, neither I nor London boroughs have the power to seize property linked to corruption or to sanction individuals. The powers currently available are very limited. For example, boroughs can apply for an empty dwelling management order to bring vacant property back to use, but only under very limited conditions. Any new powers, therefore, rely upon action from the government. I note that both the Justice Secretary and the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities have recently expressed support for using the properties of sanctioned individuals for humanitarian purposes. I welcome these comments, and I'd be happy to work with the government to develop these proposals. In the meantime, I've called for other measures, including an expanded range of taxes on overseas purchases, a robust register of beneficial property ownership, and more use of unexplained wealth orders. But each of these measures would need to be carefully designed, to limit loopholes and be backed up with sufficient resources for monitoring and enforcement.
Thank you, Mayor. I really welcome your comments about the impact on the housing market here in London. It's not just those people that own their houses outright, but it has a knock-on impact on people in the social housing sector, people wanting to access shared ownership. And of course, you'll be not surprised to hear me mention private renters as well. So you've also talked about how Transparency International's estimates around £1.1 billion in 100 properties alone. And I know that in Bishop's Avenue in Barnet, there are 120 bedrooms that could be put to better use rather than just being rotting places to park dirty cash. So those conversations that you've had with the government, what progress are they making to make sure that we can actually work with the government to either seize properties from overseas or do that in a proper measured way, and to make sure that we can stop the flow of dirty cash from Russia really impacting our city's economy and housing market?
Well, I think as I said in my answer, I think, we've heard publicly members of the Cabinet expressing their concern. I think that they've got to move quickly, because what I worry about is, fire sales, these oligarchs selling off the assets and the money leaving London. Think of the symbolic impact of, Putin's mates having their properties being used for housing Ukrainians, and the pressure they would then bring upon Putin because they're worried about their assets being lost. And that's why it's really important the government moves quickly. Other countries in mainland Europe have moved quickly, seizing assets, seizing property and so forth. We've been a bit slow, but when I listen to what Michael Gove said and others, I think they get it, but the issue is speed, and that's why I'm really keen for them to move quickly.
And I'm really also interested in the point that you've made about the Overseas Assets Register. Again, it has impacts here in the Ukraine crisis and addressing which Russian oligarchs own what in London. But more broadly, as we've seen through the cladding and fire safety scandal, just basic issues with ordinary tenant issues, tracking down who actually is the beneficial owner of a property in London is virtually impossible unless you can afford private investigators, as some boroughs have been forced to do. And so I wonder what better use we could put that to, and how we can make sure that we really know who owns the homes in London.
I mean, if we think about it, thank you for your question, but if you think about it logically, what could be the reason why you're trying to hide what you own? Right, it begs the question. But secondly, you're right, has a inflationary ratchet effect on property, all these properties being bought and used as gold bricks, and what compounds this and is offensive to Londoners, and then they're left empty. I'm not against foreigners coming to London. Some of my best friends and family are foreigners. What I object to is Russian oligarchs and others close to Putin and others buying property in London as gold bricks and leaving them empty. And that's why it's really important. We have at last, 6 years after David Cameron promised it, a list of all those properties owned by people from overseas, beneficial ownership, really important, so we can see who owns what. But also, at the best, all a council can do is double their council tax. If you're a billionaire, do you really object to paying £2,000 rather than £1,000 in council tax? So we need to give councils more powers as well in relation to empty properties, not just charging more in council tax, but seizing them if they're just sitting there empty, not being used.
Thank you. Before we go to the next question, will the Assembly agree to suspend Standing Order number 2.9b in accordance with the provisions of the Standing Order 1.1h in order to allow the remaining business on the agenda to be completed? Thank you. It's right. Wouldn't, but there we are. So the next question is in the name of Assembly Member Bailey. This should be fun.
Can't be that bad chairing, Keith. Thank you for your question. Fraud is not a victimless crime. It can and does have a devastating impact on people's lives, particularly the most vulnerable. The nature of fraud and the prevalence of online offending I beg your pardon, sorry. It's fraud and cybercrime.
No, it's Assembly Member Bailey.
I beg your pardon. Sorry, Neil.
Working with communities in London. Number 1253.
Sorry, I've got it. Sorry, Sean. The role of Mayor and the GLA as an organisation exists to serve London's communities. During my time at City Hall, I've made it clear that everything we do must be in partnership with Londoners, rooted in the daily reality and lived experiences of our communities. This is the only way we can truly help to improve Londoners' quality of life and tackle the barriers and challenges that so many face. One of the ways I've worked to achieve this is by making significant funding available to support the charity and voluntary sectors, which have such a wealth of knowledge about how best to support Londoners, but have been starved of investment from the government since 2010. Over the last few years, I've invested more than £100 million in this support. That includes £70 million to support young people and £13 million to support communities responding to COVID. I've also ensured that London's diverse communities are at the heart of decision-making, prioritising proper representation on all major boards, including the London Recovery Board, Skills for London Board and the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group. In addition to these formal channels, my teams are continuously working on new methods of bringing grassroots perspectives into decision-making, whether that's through our public engagement platform, Talk London, or by supporting peer research. Most recently, my skills team carried out peer research to develop the skills roadmap for London. This helped ensure we are designing and promoting an adult skills offer that is inclusive and responsive to the multiple and complex needs of our city. My Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice also regularly hosts meetings with communities so they have access to the latest information and guidance. Just last week, she hosted a briefing on the cost of living crisis with leading charities attended by over 120 people, and over the past 18 months, she's hosted a monthly public health briefing with the UK Health Security Agency's Professor Kevin Fenton and NHS England's Martin McRae. The Building Strong Communities London Recovery Board mission is ensuring communities are supported to develop skills and networks to be in the best place to deliver for London, and I've worked with the City Bridge Trust to invest almost £2 million in civil society support through the Civil Society Roots programme. This is an ongoing priority for me, and I'll continue to support London's diverse communities in every way I can.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for that answer. Do you see any value in safer neighbourhood boards? Recently, we had a motion go through unanimously calling on yourself to support safer neighbourhood boards more and recognise the good work they do. So again, do you see any value in these boards?
Yeah, generally speaking, yes. Some are good, some are excellent, some are not so great. But yeah, as a general way of engaging with the community, I do.
Well, can you then go back to MOPAC and ask them why they don't? For instance, your crime plan talks a lot about engagement but doesn't mention the word safer neighbourhood boards once. Many safer neighbourhood boards will talk about the fact that MOPAC is very hard to work with. Funding that's promised to them doesn't come in a timely fashion. So the first thing I'd ask is, can you go back and make sure that these things are taken care of?
Yeah, of course I can take that away.
Okay.
I'll write to the member to give a response to his point.
Okay, because the deeper thing is, I've written to Sophie Linden now a number of times about safer neighbourhoods boards, and she's come back with some underwhelming responses. The real worry here is people are under the impression that MOPAC is going to run safer neighbourhood boards into the ground by not supporting them properly. The funding is there, you've committed the funding, but they don't provide it in a timely fashion. Yeah, they're worried that they're going to run them into the ground. Can you give us an assurance that is not the case?
Yeah, that's not the intention, but let me take away what you've said in relation to the lack of support. You're saying some boards feel, and let's see what we can do to address that, because I think they have got an important role to play. As I said, some are excellent, some are good, some are less good, but the more support we give them, the more that can be good or excellent, isn't it?
Thank you for that. The three things I believe they'd ask for is greater flexibility around how the funding is provided, what it can be used for, the funding to arrive on time, and also for MOPAC to just attend meetings and give them more airtime, because they're very worried that they're being sidelined. I go again, the police and crime plan talks about engagement but doesn't talk about safer neighbourhood boards, and they took this as quite a worrying sign.
Okay, can I take it away? Can I take it away and come back to you on that?
Thank you. Chair.
Oh, thank you very much. You've already answered Assemblymember Garrett's question. No, it's actually been withdrawn, so you won't get the chance to...
I had a good answer, though.
Yes. So we now move to the question in the name of Assemblymember Sheikh, which is 1150 London Plan Guidance Impact.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. London's planning system must put sustainable development at its heart, and I've recently adopted groundbreaking guidance on whole life cycle carbon and circular economy development, which will shift the dial on embodied carbon and prioritise the retention of existing buildings where this is the most sustainable and appropriate option. We've carried out public engagement on guidance that shows how urban greening can be achieved, that sets out the requirements for air quality neutral and air quality positive development, and that embeds sustainable transport, walking and cycling into developments and local plans. The planning system must help tackle the housing crisis and create decent, safe homes for Londoners. That's why we've also recently carried out public engagement on 4 pieces of housing-related guidance, including a new set of housing design standards. We're engaging widely on new fire safety guidance, which builds on the requirement in my London plan for all development to meet the highest standards of fire safety. These guidance documents won't just lead to better outcomes, but will help get more people engaged in how our city develops. For example, the characterisation and growth strategies guidance requires local authorities to engage with communities to identify what's valued locally and to inform the vision of how the area should change. The approach to guidance is also being made more user-friendly, helping people to engage in the development of the guidance and making it more accessible for the community to use it when it's adopted. The guidance programme itself includes targeted engagement, reaching out to specific groups to inform relevant pieces of guidance, such as the involvement of peer outreach workers in developing the Public London Charter.
Thanks very much, Sadiq. And I have to say it's been a real pleasure to hold the planning and regeneration brief for the Labour Group over this past municipal year, being able to spearhead our responses to your LPG consultations has been a vital learning curve to understand our London planning system better, but also beginning to contemplate further improvements, which I hope I can pick up with you in the future, although I can't quite hear myself think because there's some mumbling across the chamber, so hopefully that will quiet down in a moment. What's become...
Bad manners.
Yeah, it's a bit rude and a bit annoying, to be honest.
Waiting for the Deputy Chair to step in.
But what has become increasingly obvious to me during the process of writing the Labour Group's consultation responses to LPG is that actually, with the government being desperately slow to put any pen to paper on planning reforms, it's sort of holding us back a bit. So, for instance, when I was responding to the air quality LPG alongside the Labour group, what became really clear to me is that we needed tougher national standards for designing environmentally sustainable homes and more investment in retrofitting and technology solutions, which the government just isn't putting their money where their mouth is. So I wanted to ask you, what more can we do to get the government moving on the planning reforms that we need, and also particularly on, for instance, the retrofitting programme that we desperately need in London and the UK?
So thanks for your question and the work you're doing in this area. So we can't do this ourselves, and so we need the government to step up in relation to standards, national standards. Our standards are well ahead of the government's. We need them to bring their national standards up to our level and some. They should be setting a net zero carbon standard and include an assessment of whole life cycle carbon. But also we need funding for energy efficiency programmes. They should have cut VAT yesterday in relation to people facing the bills they're facing. I welcome the announcement they made to zero VAT in relation to some retrofit. That will benefit the wealthiest, who own cars as well, by the way, rather than helping the poorest Londoners who need support in relation to retrofitting. You will be aware that a considerable amount of carbon comes from workplace and homes. We're doing what we can on transport, but without government support, we can't really tackle workplace and homes. We need government support there as well.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the climate and energy crisis, I think this government talks the talks and very rarely walks the walk. But just back onto planning, I'm really sorry, Assembly Member, don't interrupt, it's rude.
Members, yes, if we can allow the member to ask the question, please.
Tony, calm down. Calm down.
So just back onto my final supplementary, please, we've had a little bit more decorum for this part, is would you consider, back onto planning, for instance, when it comes to such vital issues like embedding the climate emergency in our planning system, we obviously want to make this as accessible for Londoners to participate in as possible. So specifically on your LPG consultations, would you consider making easy read versions or even videos, for instance? Because I've become increasingly obsessed, if I'm honest with you, about ways that we can democratise our planning system, decision-making and engage more Londoners. So, yeah, the specific question to you is, would you consider making easy-read versions and sort of small supplementary videos so more people can engage with the planning system and specifically respond to your LPG consultations?
Yeah, no, I'm more than happy to listen to your excellent ideas about making this more user-friendly to engage more people. I want Londoners not to be consumers, not just citizens, but active citizens. And so any advice you've got, I'll ask my office to arrange to meet with you about ideas you've got. We've got to make it as accessible as possible. The more we can energise Londoners to get engaged in this area, the more pressure there is from them. We can try and have world-leading policies. So I'll ask my office to go away and meet with you to discuss any ideas you've got.
Thank you. I look forward to that meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We now go to the question name of Assembly Member Dr. Sahota around levelling up white paper. Question number 1135, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. I welcome the levelling up white paper, but it does not provide the whole solution to the problems it seeks to address. While the government rightly outlines historic underinvestment in the Midlands and the North, it fails to address the need to level up within regions as well as between them. It does not estimate the level of investment needed across the country to achieve its aim, let alone provide meaningful funding. Its devolution framework tweaks the status quo rather than offering radical change, and it's nothing to say about the government's ambitions for London. London has some of the highest levels of deprivation in the country. 27% of Londoners were living in relative poverty even before the pandemic hit, and the poverty rate of black, Asian and minority ethnic people is nearly twice that of white people. The government's Levelling Up Advisory Council must now work with all parts of London's government and communities to understand the reality of deprivation here and how structural and ethnic inequalities mean that some Londoners are at much greater risk of poor outcomes, including in health. This is clearly set out in my health inequality strategy, with the implementation plan highlighting the need to focus on ethnic inequalities, including those caused by structural and income inequalities, alongside other drivers of health inequalities. The government's recent response on the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities recommendations confirmed their plans for a new white paper on health disparities, which I hope will focus on tackling the deep inequalities in the health of different communities, including in London.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Mayor. One of the inequalities, of course, is overcrowding and poor housing, underlying deep health inequalities in the capital, as has been exposed by the pandemic. So are you concerned about the government's plans to move much-needed housing investment away from London as part of its levelling up white paper?
Of course I am. And I think that what it leads to is me repeating that you don't make a country more equal by making London poorer. You will see every day, not just as a member of this Assembly, but as a GP, the consequences of overcrowded. We saw it evidenced with the spread of the pandemic, particularly in those communities where there's overcrowding. But it has an impact on a whole host of other issues as well. We need people to have decent-sized homes, good quality homes. And that's why we're lobbying the government, not just changes in legislation in relation to action against private landlords, but also to make sure we've got the funding to build the family-sized homes that are genuinely affordable that Londoners need.
Thank you. And the other thing, of course, you touched upon is that the BMA community was more adversely affected. And this is also true in terms of the sharp end of the climate emergency, and your data has shown, right, that the BME community is affected more adversely by poor air quality. Do you think that the government's refusal to back a national scrapping scheme and properly fund the TfL is hampering your efforts to address the issues of improving air quality in London, and particularly for the BME communities?
Yeah, so one of the things the government wanted me to do last year was to take away free travel for children, right? They also wanted me to take away free travel for those above the age of 60. We managed to resist it, but that just shows they don't understand the difference good public transport has on the quality of lives of poorer people. And that's why it's really important to continue to try and persuade the government, not just for a long-term deal for TfL, but to give us financial support to have policies that address the air quality. That includes a scrappage scheme to assist those people to transition from polluting vehicles to other forms of transport, whether it's a cleaner vehicle or going towards using more public transport and so forth.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. Now have a question from Assembly Member Harani, number 1099, improving section detection.
Thank you. There are many factors that contribute to successful detection and conviction, from initial investigations through to an efficient and timely journey through the courts. Every step of the process has been made harder by a decade of government austerity. The police lost thousands of officers and staff, including experienced, skilled detectives. The justice system is in crisis, with nearly 16,000 Crown Court cases waiting to be heard in London alone. And we must also acknowledge that trust and confidence is fundamental to the effectiveness of our police and the justice system. Without it, fewer victims will come forward and fewer citizens will provide vital intelligence to help prevent, solve and prosecute crime. I've done everything in my power to address these issues: record investment in police and in victim services, the appointment of London's first independent victims commissioner, and decisive action to address declining public confidence in policing. My police and crime plan sets out my expectation that sanction detection rates increase, along with the action needed to support this. I'll hold the MPS Commissioner to account for improving police investigation and will continue to press justice partners to make similar improvements in their work. The government must produce a properly funded plan to ensure all parts of the criminal justice system focus on addressing what are unacceptably low detection, prosecution and conviction rates. Most urgently, the government must allocate some of the expanded Nightingale Court capacity that London so desperately needs to create a dedicated rape offences court.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for addressing the points on the MPS as well, because clearly the MPS have a key role to play locally in improving conviction rates too. And a recent inspection into the CPS in South London found that only 40% of the files submitted by the Met to the CPS there fully met the national file standard. For rape and sexual offences, 70% of the files looked at did not even meet the standard. And the report also noted that the feedback from the CPS to the Met to help to improve them is inadequate. Given rape charges have fallen to a pitiful 1.3% nationally, and reported sexual offences are at their highest levels on record, criminals under this government are literally getting away with murder. What needs to be done to rectify this issue?
Well, I think the starting point was an acknowledgement by the government in the form of the Justice Secretary and Home Secretary apologising for the appalling conviction rates in relation to rape. We're now starting to see an uplift in officers, but we need to make sure the whole CJS understands this issue and has the support and resources after 12 years of cuts. to address this. You can't, not expect consequences when officers are going down, experience is being lost, protections being lost, the CPS is having cuts, courts are closing down, Crown Court and Magistrates Court, and then be surprised when there's the problems that you're articulated in your question. So we need to make sure there's the right policies in place. We need to make sure there's the right resources in place. We need to make sure there's the right training in place to address these issues. It's shocking that you've got victims of rape not wanting to go ahead and report it because they've got no confidence that the action will be taken to make sure justice occurs. And that means the perpetrator, as you said, is getting away with it and is committing more crime.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And the government has not only been soft on crime by taking £1 billion out of London's policing since 2010, but also soft on the causes of crime by cutting local authorities who provide many of the services that are proven to have an impact on long-term crime as well. Indeed, many members of the government are currently having to spend their own time answering police questionnaires, so there could be a conflict of interest if they were to be tougher on crime. But the government has decided against being tougher on those who commit violence against women in particular by going against introducing misogyny as a hate crime, which could have been used to lead to longer sentences. Do you think the government has been tough enough on reforming prison sentences in recent years, and will you reconfirm your commitment to supporting misogyny being recorded as a hate crime?
Yeah, no, I think misogyny should be recorded as a hate crime. I think there needs to be also changes in relation to, for example, making the harassment of women in a public place a criminal offence. I think there should be longer sentences for those convicted of serious violent and sexual offenders. I think it's really important. I think the criminal justice system, when it comes to sentencing, should both punish and reform. That means not using prisons as warehouses of people convicted just sit around 23 hours a day. In the University of Crime. We need to make sure prison does both of those things. Look, you can't be surprised after 12 years of cuts in the prison service, the probation service, in courts, in police, in the CPS, that you've got a situation where crime's got up in the numbers it has. From City Hall, we're doing what we can with record funding for the police and for preventative services. You'll be aware, as a former councillor in Brent, the consequences of the number of years of cuts to great local authorities like Brent in relation to your ability to provide preventative services. And it's really important that people realise that cuts have consequences, and you've articulated some of those consequences.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I've seen Assembly Member Devenish.
Hello again, Mr. Mayor. Well, it's very good of you to blame the government. Are you responsible after 6 years as the Police and Crime Commissioner for London for any of the issues we've just been discussing?
No, I'm not going to shy away from explaining to Londoners the consequences of the cuts over the last 12 years. As Member Harani pointed out, we've lost £1 billion because of central government cuts in our policing. Thousands of experienced officers have left the police service. We're trying to fill that massive hole left by the government. We can't do it alone. When I became mayor, roughly speaking, 80% of funding of the police came from central government. Because of cuts, that's gone down to approaching 70%. So we're doing what we can from City Hall. But it's like one hand tied behind my back, and that's why we support from the government.
And my question again, Mr. Mayor, are you at all responsible for any of these issues and how you've conducted yourself over the last 6 years?
Yeah, I'm responsible for addressing some of the failings of the government, which is one of the reasons why we invested record sums in relation to the police.
Honestly.
Record sums that actually Senator Harani failed to mention with the Young Londoners Fund. The Violence Reduction Unit, the first in England, we've now invested in a public health approach. So we're doing what we can in relation to this matter. But what we'd like is less crime being committed, whether it's by members of the Assembly or by others as well.
Oh dear. So, do you agree with Sir Tom Windsor's comments last week? It's unjustifiable for the police to decline to attend at and properly investigate crimes of serious nature, including the ones that AM Harani has mentioned, but also burglary.
I do, and it's a report around national policing that Tom Windsor's report talked about, and I think he's right. I think in the past, because of government cuts, the Met Police hasn't been able to go and speak to those who are the victims of burglary. As a consequence of partly our investment, the Met Police now can do the sort of stuff they weren't doing in the past, and I'm really proud that we've managed to invest in the police. They can now respond to burglaries in a way they weren't able to in the past because of the cuts from the government.
Well, if that's the case, Mr Mayor, why is the sanction detection rate for residential burglary at an all-time low since figures started being collected in 2013?
What we've seen in relation to burglary is a reduction in burglary, 17% in the year before the pandemic, 32% since then. What we have seen, though, is because of the cuts I mentioned, some of those detection rates not being as high as they should be. Tom Windsor talks about this in his report, a national policing report. So Tom Windsor's report talks about this issue nationally, not just in London. That's why we welcome the U-turn from the government, partial U-turn. 21,000 officers cut. They're funding 20,000 officers, still less than they were, but that will lead to, I'm hoping, improvements in the sanction detection rate. It's too low, it should be much higher.
And you mentioned earlier how the Home Secretary, etc., have made an apology. Have you made any apologies for your conduct as Police and Crime Commissioner over the last 6 years?
No. I don't apologise.
You're perfect,
at all.
are you?
I don't apologise at all.
You're
For
perfect.
the steps we've taken. By the way, if things had been differently, there'd be somebody sitting here who's been investigated for breaking the law, right? So London has made a choice in May last year and voted for a...
Give us some time, Mr Mayor. We'll sort that one out.
Helps the police rather than makes more work for the police. Right choice, in my view, don't you think?
No, I don't actually. I'll leave it there, though, Deputy Chairman.
So here we have...
Thank you, Mr Mayor.
People supporting alleged criminals from the Tory side.
Yeah, I'm not sure you can quite make that statement. You might want to...
Is there a point of personal explanation from the potential lawbreaker?
Well, as I say, I think you have to be very careful where you're going, and I don't need to tell you, Mr Mayor, because you're a qualified barrister.
I'm more than happy to talk about the alleged lawbreaker if you want, Deputy Chair.
No, fine.
Are you sure?
I was just asking that you're careful
He's in
around...
the room. He can speak about it if he wants to.
Mr Mayor, I was just asking you to be a bit cautious, that's all.
I wish he'd been more careful in the parties he attended.
We don't have parliamentary privilege, as you well know.
I'm well aware. I'm well aware.
Which is something you have, of course, enjoyed in the past. Mr Mayor, we now look at the question from Assembly Member Berry, and it's question number 0976 about updating your housing strategy.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. My London housing strategy was published in May 2018, following extensive consultation, and my team is now focused on the action needed to deliver it. The strategy is kept under review, and I am satisfied that it remains the best diagnosis of the challenges London faces and the correct response to overcoming them. The London housing strategy sets out my 5 priorities for housing: building homes for Londoners, delivering genuinely affordable homes, high-quality homes and inclusive neighbourhoods, a fairer deal for private renters and leaseholders, tackling homelessness and rough sleepers. These remain my priorities. My housing team is focused on delivery against these, and I want them to be able to commit their full resource to doing so. I'm proud of the progress we've already made, including supporting a renaissance in council home building, which has now seen over 11,000 City Hall-funded council homes started since 2018, ensuring that the 21-26 Affordable Homes programme will be majority social rent, delivering the land fund to allow us to intervene more directly in housing delivery, successfully pushing the government to take action to improve security for renters and address building safety, implementing a landmark resident ballot requirement to improve estate regeneration, and ensuring that all rough sleepers had a safe place to stay during the pandemic. My housing strategy has enabled me to tackle the root causes of the challenges London faces, while also adapting quickly to changing circumstances. The work required to remediate building safety failings has been more extensive than we could have envisaged in 2018, but the strategy's focus on high-quality homes and a fair deal for leaseholders has provided a fair foundation. We've been able to react to events, including flexing our right to buy back offer for councils to support the humanitarian response to the Afghanistan evacuation. There is undoubtedly more to do. Increasing supply is the central pillar of my strategy, but this has been made more challenging due to the pressures created by building safety remediation, the need to retrofit homes to support our moves towards net zero, and soaring costs owed to the macroeconomic situation. I'll continue to do everything in my power, but the government needs to step up properly to properly fund housing in London and support our recovery.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Mayor, for that detailed response, talking about the actions you're taking and the policy changes you've made since the housing strategy first came out.
I think the breadth of all of that ultimately just provides more evidence for my original question that your housing strategy is now out of date and does need an update. Now, I want to pick up particularly on overcrowding, because this is a topic the Housing Committee investigated in its meeting in January. We heard evidence of the causes behind overcrowding, its extent, the consequences, the lack of data, and we've produced recommendations which we've sent you. And I don't want to preempt your response to the recommendations officially, but it was very clear from the investigation that overcrowding is becoming even more of a serious problem for Londoners. The Deputy Mayor for Housing told us at the meeting that overcrowding worsened during the pandemic, perhaps to as high as 15% in London. And we can contrast that with the baseline figure for overcrowding shown in your current housing strategy implementation plan, which was only 7.5% in 2015. I don't need to tell you how overcrowding exacerbated the pandemic and made the impacts of it worse on some parts of the population. So, I mean, this change of circumstance on its own, doesn't that warrant a review and a new housing strategy, particularly given the main recommendation from the Housing Committee was an overcrowding action plan?
I'm unclear how a family living in overcrowded accommodation is assisted by a new document presented by City Hall. Look, the strategy is there. Right, and rather than officer time being spent, writing a new strategy, we've got to deliver on the strategy by working with the government to make sure more affordable homes are built for families. In addition to the housing strategy, we have the London Plan, we've got the design codes, the SPGs. We've now got funding from the government, working with councils I was in Enfield this week, 3-bedroom homes, so more families can move into them from overcrowded accommodation. The issue is the funding to build the homes that we need. We've got a London Plan which makes it quite clear the numbers of homes we need. We also require councils to assess the demand for family-sized homes in their borough. And so the issue is the support for those councils building the family homes, but also we now have a London Plan that requires developers to ensure a percentage is genuinely affordable. So I'm unclear how officer time being spent writing a new strategy addresses those issues.
I mean, we do think there are gaps. We'll be, again, hopefully this week, writing to you about other issues around potentially not having non-construction ways of introducing new homes, and that isn't covered in your current housing strategy. Now, one thing that's a lot of the targets in your current housing strategy are set for 2021, and this does line up with the Affordable Homes programme that originally ran from 2016 to 2021. Now, you've mentioned you've got a new Affordable Homes programme. This runs to 2026, so it must be time for new targets and a new housing strategy to back it up. You've redone the police and crime plan from 2017, so surely you would redo the 2018 housing strategy next and start on that quite soon.
The logic of that means we'd also have a new London Plan.
I wouldn't mind that either. You know I wasn't completely happy with the London Plan or the housing strategy.
That means 2.5 years. 2.5 years of officer time and money doing a new London Plan rather than delivering on the London Plan that we have, which is bold. It's world leading in relation to our expectations, and it's leading to a situation where 13% of new homes were affordable with the dodgy definition of the previous guy, and it's now 40%. With a stricter definition where it is genuinely affordable.
I mean, you know that we think, and I think, that there are gaps to fill, and at the very least, for the London Plan, some early alterations would be a really useful thing to see. But I genuinely think the housing strategy needs a review. It needs reprioritising towards things we can do without building, as well as building, things we can do around, I mean, the Kerslake review has come out, for example. You've got a new deputy mayor, Tom Copley. He might have some more progressive ideas. He wants to put his stamp on the old strategy. I'll keep pressing you for this in that case. I was hoping for it yesterday.
I'm afraid, Assembly Member, you're out of time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We now have a question in the name of Assembly Member Hall, number 1256, on London Power.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. I set up London Power in January 2020 to offer fair, affordable and green energy because London, with higher rates of prepayment meters and low levels of switching, is hit particularly hard by the dysfunctional energy market. Energy prices rose to unprecedented levels over the last year, and the resulting energy retail crisis has seen over 30 energy suppliers fail since London Power launched. In the face of high energy prices, London Power, like other responsible energy companies, is advising customers to stay with their current supplier through the winter. This approach has led to the lowest levels of energy switching across the market on record, 73% lower than last year. Despite this, London Power has over 6,400 satisfied customers with an excellent Trustpilot rating. Energy prices will increase by 54% this April, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine caused already record high wholesale gas prices to double. Customer acquisition remains on hold across the industry as best offers are substantially above the price cap. Londoners will already be paying over £6 billion to heat and power their homes over the next year, double what they were paying in 2020, and prices were expected to increase even further this autumn. Given all this, I'm focused on doing all I can to help the most vulnerable. In December, I announced a £51 million package to tackle fuel poverty to help Londoners stay warm and improve the energy efficiency of thousands of homes. My Warmer Homes Advice Service supports low-income Londoners through advice support with energy debt and access to bill discounts. I've allocated a further £3.7 million to advise Londoners in financial hardship. I continue to urge the government to help the most vulnerable with the unprecedented increase in energy costs. VAT on energy bills should be cut immediately, and households cannot be expected to repay the £200 energy bill rebate while energy bills are still rising. Taxing the windfall profits of energy companies would pay for all of this, and it's an obvious way to reintroduce some fairness into a market that has long been skewed against the consumer. Now more than ever, it's of the utmost importance that the government adopts an energy strategy that rapidly reduces our fossil fuel consumption and moves us more quickly to a net zero clean energy system.
So when can we expect London Power to break even if it's not acquiring new customers?
Well, as I've said, because we're not acquiring new customers, we won't be reducing the reliance upon City Hall. We had seen a reduction in relation to reliance up until the pandemic began. We paused marketing activities in March 2020. Those marketing activities are still paused because any offer that London Power or any supplier would make would be above what the cap is, and that would be immoral to be asking people to join London Power and pay more than the energy cap.
Thank you very much. Labour Group, you have 5 minutes. I don't know if you want to. Yes?
Yes, thank you very much, Deputy Chair. I believe that Assembly Member Dr Sahota may wish to raise some points about healthy children, which otherwise we would miss out on.
How perceptive of you. Oh, we're out of time. Sorry. Sorry, do forgive me. You could ask a supplementary on that question, if you want.
Well, I actually wanted to raise the issue of healthy children with the Mayor. And I know that the party...
Sorry, Assembly Member Deval made the point quite clearly that there must be links. So you do have 5 minutes, which you can use as a supplementary on this question. Is that not correct, Assembly Member Deval? Otherwise, I'm afraid I can't take your question.
Yes, I will ask a question on energy.
It's on London. Can I help you? Remember, Dr. Zoda, it's got to be on London Power.
Sorry, Chair, is that the ruling that you said earlier on? Is it on London Power that therefore I can switch into congestion and into road pricing as well?
He wants to ask the health of children in relation to London Power, Chair. I mean, clearly.
Can I be given the opportunity to speak with Chair?
I just want you to use your 5 minutes, really. So please, if you can just be creative, then I'll be grateful. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I know that energy crisis in this country is very important. London Power was one of the ways you wanted to lower the cost of energy consumption, price for Londoners. And of course, the poor housing, poor energy levels, poor heating, all has an impact on the welfare of children. And the government yesterday, having missed the opportunity of reducing the burden on the least least, so the most vulnerable children has been accepted. So can you talk to us about how the Chancellor of Chequer could have yesterday helped to improve the health of the children living in London, please?
Well, firstly, can I just say, Deputy Chair and members of the Assembly, I think Keith Prince has aged 10 years over the last 3 hours. And so,
Only 10.
I think he deserves our thanks for stepping in today. But look, it is a serious issue in relation to the link between energy, fuel poverty and the impacts on children. If you're a child in a home that could be overcrowded, you could be cold, it has an impact on you, not just what you do at school, but in fact a whole host of issues as well. Some member Marina Ahmed talked about people she's spoken to suffering now. I'm hearing stories when I speak to constituents across London. Kids are wearing 2, 3, 4 layers in the house. I appreciate this week's been quite warm. Last week wasn't, nor the weeks before that. And it is heartbreaking when you're meeting children who are wearing 2, 3, 4 layers inside their home. They're going to school, and there's more warmth in school than there is at home. And that's an impact on them. It is really important. If you've got levers to improve the quality of life of those individuals, you use them. The Chancellor could have yesterday really made a difference to these families' lives. He chose not to. That was a choice. The budget was a choice. He chose not to.
And Mr. Mayor, of course, food is nothing more than but a source of energy. Nothing more than a source of energy.
I'm really sorry, Dr. Zode.
You've got to give 10 out of 10 for
and I want to congratulate you on the quality, by improving the quality of food that's being advertised to the young people in this London. And you will take some courage from the fact that an independent review, peer-reviewed paper by the School of Tropical Medicine found that you directly improved the quality of food eaten by children, and that's the source of energy which they were taking on in London.
Mr. Mayor, if I could, please, because I think we have got a level of humour here. On what is a very serious question, I hasten to add. If you can try and answer and involve London Power somewhere in the answer, I'd be very grateful. It would help me and not upset the Assembly member Duval too much.
Deputy Chair, I'm sure you'll remember, because you're of a similar vintage of me. The advert, younger, the Ready Brick advert, you eat some Ready Brick and there's a glow around you. London Power provides a similar glow to our customers.
Thank you. I'm going to call it an end there. I think that was very helpful. Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Before you go, Mr. Mayor, can I thank you for your answers, and can I also thank you for the year, because of course we won't be seeing you again for 6 weeks until after the election. So thank you, Mr. Mayor. You may leave the chamber. Thank you. Right, so now I need to ask the Assembly if they would agree the motion which is set out on the agenda in my name, which is that the Assembly notes the answers to the questions asked. No amendment from you, Assembly member. Thank you. So, finally, number 6, proposed delegation. Can I ask the Assembly to agree that in relation to urgent matters only, a general delegation of authority in respect of the Assembly powers and functions, apart from those that cannot be delegated under the GL Act 1999, be granted to the Chair of the GLA Oversight Committee in consultation with party group leaders, relevant committee chairs or chairs, and the Chair of the Assembly from the close of this meeting until the next meeting of the London Assembly, which will now be the annual meeting on Monday the 9th of May 2022. That agreed. Thank you. So, the date of the next meeting. The next scheduled meeting of the London Assembly will be the annual meeting, which will take place on the 9th of May 2022 at 10 a.m. in the chamber here in the new City Hall. Finally, any other business? As far as I'm aware, there is no urgent business requiring consideration. However, members are reminded that the Trust for London is here at City Hall today to give a lunchtime briefing straight after this meeting. Members are welcome to attend, but you've got to bring your own lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.